Hey, Eric.
Hold on a sec.
Yep.
Bring up the audio. Hello.
How are you?
Not too bad. You hear me okay?
Yep, I got you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, just adjust a little bit. Sometimes my computer mic doesn't work so great, or actually I think it works fine. Just people have a problem with it on their other end sometimes.
You sound good to me.
So if that's good, I'm good.
Cool. Eric, just before we get going, how much time do you have for this today?
Rest of the night? No, I'm good. I don't. Let me just check my calendar. I don't think I have anything coming up.
Sure.
But hour, whatever.
I'm hearing my own voice a little bit. Do you have a headset that you can put on?
Yeah. With Skype, normally I'd call in on my phone on a phone number if we had that problem. But with Skype, I don't know if I can split it with the phone. I don't. I use my iPhone earbuds, but I used to have a good headset for the computer, and I don't think I have it anymore. Crap.
Yeah, the AirPods aren't bad. I actually wore them for the first few episodes.
They don't actually work with my. I don't think the pins line up here.
Oh, I got you.
Hear me?
Yep.
No, see, I don't hear you.
Okay.
That's the problem. This thing doesn't. Say again?
Hello.
Yeah.
It's okay. It wasn't a huge deal. It's just a little bit of an echo, but it's not gonna throw me off.
Yeah, sorry about that.
That's cool.
Let me just. I have two different microphones. I can potentially change this here.
I think it might have gone
okay?
now. We might have had an initial lag, and maybe it's okay now. Yeah.
All right.
I think it's okay. Yeah. Well, Eric, thanks for taking the time. I know you're a busy guy. You've been doing the rounds on podcasts, and I'm sure you've got a very busy life otherwise between hobbies and work and travel and that kind of stuff. So thank you for giving me the time.
Oh, no worries. Always available to podcast. If somebody asks, I do it. That's my rule.
I mean, you talk about a lot of stuff. You've got your intellectual hands in a lot of different pies. So it's, I'm not sure where we're going to go today, and that's fine. We'll just take it wherever the conversation flows. But maybe we can just start with a little bit of your background. And I know a lot of people will have heard from you before, so maybe the Cole's Notes version is sufficient. And then a little explainer on the work with Libbitcoin, because I think maybe some people will be unfamiliar with the role of that work.
Yeah, so I'll start with the Libbitcoin stuff, I guess.
Sure.
The Libbitcoin is it's the longest running full node project after the Satoshi. Sorry, if my dogs are coming through on your mic, that's going to happen. After the Satoshi prototype started in 2011 by Amir Taki and Patrick Straitman, and I started working on it about 6 years ago because I was working on my own hardware wallet project, which I eventually put on the shelf and just kept working on the Bitcoin. But over time, I ended up working through all the libraries, doing a lot of refactoring and new work, and I kind of guide the project now. Libbitcoin is not in any way like a fork of any other code. It was started with one line of code committed by Patrick Straitman and grew from that. And the objective has always been a little different than other stuff that's out there. It's C++, so it's the same language essentially as Satoshi used, but it was designed to be a developer toolkit, so it's made for building other things. It's factored into different libraries. It also takes a different approach, makes different compromises than other things because it's designed to build things, and because it doesn't have, it moves more easily because there's a smaller group of people that work on it, and it made different engineering trade-offs. So it was the day I started working on Bitcoin, I decided I was going to I found it, and I found Amir, and I went out and visited him within a few days, and I've been working on Libbitcoin ever since. So eventually that led me into other stuff. It took a few years before I fully understood the code, and then started thinking through some of the economic aspects, which is been a long-term interest of mine.
Right.
What was the first part of your question?
Well, so we'll just from that, what is the role in the ecosystem of Libbitcoin, right? So if we have the Satoshi's implementation, then we have Libbitcoin. Like, what's the reason for its existence? I guess is the question.
Well, the Satoshi client was a prototype, right? It was clearly Satoshi was not a professional developer. There's no question. If you ask any seasoned developer when they look at the code, even today, it would be fairly obvious. So there were certain approaches that were not ideal.
Sorry, why is it obvious? Just in the way that it's written?
I mean, yeah, just everything about it was screamed unprofessional. But
why is it sloppy, or there's bugs, or what? Because I'm not technical.
There's bugs in all software. I mean, it's not like question of bug free or not bug free. It's just the approach to writing the code. I mean, I guess you could draw an analogy. If somebody was a professional writer and they took an amateur writer and they wrote some important stuff, but it was really amateurish writing, you would be able to tell if you were a professional writer, right?
Right.
And you can tell as a professional coder that that Satoshi was not I mean, he might have say he was an engineer who had some experience with code. That would actually track very well. Or a scientist, right, who wasn't a professional coder, so had this fairly deep understanding of what he wanted to do and just got it done. Although you do meet people that have been coding for a long time that have similar approaches to writing code, so it's possible that he was a developer, but it doesn't seem likely. Anyway, the code originally was largely written in one file, this massive thing, and I think written in Visual Studio, which is kind of not the professional developers, especially this environment, environment of choice. And a lot of that stuff still carries over to this day. But that's not the reason for Libbitcoin. It's just that if you were going to do it, do what he did from scratch, you would do it differently. The objective was to build. So Amir had several objectives, one of which was to create a community of people who were independent of the group that was developing Bitcoin D at the time. Amir was the one that created BIP1. He created the BIP system to try to open up the decision-making process around changes to not just changes to the implementation, but changes to consensus. He eventually got forced out of that group, too controversial or something, I don't know. But and somewhere in there, he was running the very first fully dedicated Bitcoin exchange. It was called Bitcoin. Picked up another name at some point, and running it through his own bank account. And he was eventually that caused him some trouble. But he was looking for some code to do things he wanted to do. He started out as an online gambler and kind of self-taught coder, and found Bitcoin to solve his money problem, and then worked on it from there. So he wanted tools to do the things he was doing, in Bitcoin that just didn't exist. And Bitcoin Core, the big distinction is it's an application, right? It's an app, right? When it comes right down to it, it's not a developer library. So if you work in C++, a lot of developers will use various libraries. Say for crypto, traditionally people would use OpenSSL. For utility code, they would use Boost, which is a long-standing set of utilities for getting things done that were hard to do or just tedious in C++, right? So Libbitcoin is designed, it's kind of run a Boost model. It's a set of tools for getting things done in Bitcoin-related code that you just can't pull out of an application, right? It's a totally different design philosophy. And then you assemble those tools into applications. And Libbitcoin does do that. We have a command line tool called Bitcoin Explorer, or BX, and we have a node called Bitcoin Node, or BN. And then we have a server stack that sits on top of the node called Bitcoin Server, which is BS, unfortunate acronym. But those are, as somebody who's developed this kind of stuff before, it becomes really obvious that if you're developing a toolkit for somebody, you have to also be developing an application with the toolkit. Otherwise, you develop things that people don't need, or you don't develop the right architecture. So it has to be put to use. And so those are co-produced, the actual application and the library. But the objective is really the library. And so the applications, they're command line. They're very simple in terms of user interface, but they exercise all the capabilities in the library that are relevant in that context. So it's something to build on. It's something to build a future on, where people can put together the things they want to do. So one of the reasons people use web APIs to build Bitcoin applications is because it's easier, right? You use, I don't know, Coinbase API or something like that to do what you really should be doing with a node. Why don't you just do it with a node? Well, it's easier. Why is it easier? Because the interface to Bitcoin Core now is not designed for that kind of stuff.
Right.
So one of the objectives was to create a different community that didn't have to kind of toe the line with whoever had a commit authority, right? It's a different community. They can do what they want. So they can voice objections without worrying about losing commit authority or falling out of favor with this club. And at the time, we had the Bitcoin Foundation later kind of came along, and that became a real concern of Amir's, right? This kind of corporate money driving salaries and having a bit more say in the development of what was essentially the protocol at the time than he liked. So it creates an independent community. It creates a different approach, a different use case in terms of having a developer toolkit, and makes it possible for people to build things that are actual true Bitcoin things, not just build up on some centralized service. So its objective is not really to lead protocol changes or new discoveries. It's to provide an efficient set of tools, libraries that is comprehensive in the context of Bitcoin for people to build stuff.
Right.
So if there's not that, then there's this one application and everything just kind of has to bolt onto it somehow. So that's not really what happens. People build their own ad hoc libraries and tools. They suck data out of Bitcoin D and they put it into a database so they can query it efficiently and things like that. And that's just a lot of unnecessary work. So our objective is really to make it easier for people to build stuff that's actual Bitcoin stuff and not gravitate towards centralized services.
Right. So, but the Bitcoin still adheres with the BIP system, right? So the improvement protocols that are, let's say, integrated or implemented, the Bitcoin is equally affected?
Well, this BIP system is just a public repository of suggestions, right? They're proposals.
Right.
There's no deciding authority on what gets implemented and what doesn't get implemented. Bitcoin chooses to implement whatever proposals it wants, and so do other implementations. So adheres to. I mean, there's a crap load of BIPs that I just completely ignore. Me personally, and other people. If somebody wants to implement them, and they're not totally insane, we'll help them do that. We've had companies come along and say, hey, we want to use Libbitcoin, but it doesn't implement BIP whatever. And we say, yeah, well, that one seems fine. We'll get to that at some point. And they throw some money at, one of our devs and we prioritize it. So, or just all these things have happened. A dev comes along and says, I'm really interested in, these things and I want to implement it. And so we help them, through the process of writing consistent, code that's consistent with the library and its standards and we get it done. That's how BIP 38, BIP 39 got done. I think BIP 158 is getting done right now with corporate sponsorship. So if they affect consensus, then it's a decision we have to make on when to implement, because we do the consensus library does maintain consistency with BTC. It also has it's configurable into testnet 3, regtest, and also Litecoin testnet, and regtest, and possibly other coins that are consistent that I would consider Bitcoins, right? That follow the security principles laid out in the white paper.
Right.
So one of the objectives there was to make it configurable into these different sets of consensus rules, instead of having to fork into them, factor the code, and take what amounts to 500,000 lines of code and try to keep that current with some other implementation that's moving along rapidly, which is nigh impossible. So the ability to do that in a single compiled binary, just through a configuration file, run testnet, regtest, Litecoin, is valuable for companies, organizations, people that want to support multiple of these coins and don't want to, actually can do it with one binary on their system. It simplifies test. It greatly improves reliability, reduces deployment costs, and reduces our costs. So we've done some of that. But if you mean like tracking with BIPs, we're consistent with consensus, and in at least BTC, regtest, testnet, and Litecoin, etc.
Is there any noticeable or functional difference from the user's perspective? Would they know that they're, what they're using is running one or the other?
Well, using is kind of arbitrary. I tend to avoid that term because what's using mean? It could be just holding on to your keys, right?
Right.
But if you're mining, if you're a merchant, you're accepting Bitcoin. These different use cases would be very different, because Libbitcoin does not have a graphical user interface. It's not a wallet, right? We don't even have we have a wallet library for implementing everything you would want to do in a wallet. Various BIPs like HD keys and even stuff that's not implemented in BTC, but crypto primitives that are useful in various contexts outside of the coin. And so you have a command line tool that can do anything that a wallet could do, but you'd have to be pretty experienced in Bitcoin to actually use the command line tool to do what people do with their wallets. So it's not intended to be that. It could be at some point. We have plans to eventually evolve a graphical interface on top of these things, but that's not the priority. And so if you're a miner, et cetera, these are all very different when working with Libbitcoin. But on the other hand, if you were using it as a node and you put some other thing in front of it, you wouldn't notice the difference. Say you connected up Electrum to Libbitcoin, you would have no idea. We're not quite there yet, but that'll be there fairly soon, I think.
Right. And so is the motivation behind, or one of the motivations behind it, just to make the ecosystem more secure by offering more options that are influenced by different parties and groups and peoples, or like is that the motivation to have diverse options?
Well, one of the objectives is just to make it easier for people to build things that matter to the security model in Bitcoin, right? If you have a million so-called users that are using something that does their payments through BTC Pay or something like that, they're just one user. User again being ambiguous, but they're just one node in the graph, the security model of Bitcoin. The person who controls the consensus rules at that central point is the person that matters. They just happen to have everybody else's money to use its influence in that context. So taking those million individuals and making it easier for them to be their own node on the network is one of the objectives. Bitcoin Core is an application. You can run that application, and you can, of course, do that. That's great. But there's reasons that people build these systems on centralized services, right? Why does everybody use this payment service or these various payment services instead of just running a version of Core? It's not designed for that, right? It's not designed to run some company's payment processing. So they have to build up an awful lot. They hired some consultants, build up some infrastructure, and this is big corporate stuff. It's not designed for that. So creating a developer ecosystem is kind of in software development, in software engineering, is inevitable, right? Eventually somebody comes along and does what we've done, or what Amir started, which is to, like this happened in the browser wars. The original browsers, just applications, and then they kind of started slowly getting opened up so you could actually write code around them. And eventually, for a time, Internet Explorer was like 98% of the market. Why? Because most people run PCs or run Windows, and this API was now embedded throughout the operating system, so you could make calls, do things that you wanted to do without having to fire up the browser and run some hack into it, right? And that's kind of inevitable when you have a technology that people want to build on. So we're just, in one way, we're just providing that inevitable development toolkit for these things. Another aspect of it, as I mentioned before, is just creating a different set of people who are independent and can think independently, or at least act independently. Don't have to come to agreement with everybody else. And I think that's important, to have other voices and have other perspectives. There's been a few small number of things that I've personally been very kind of vocal about in terms of, proposals that are kind of taken as uncontroversial in the development of Bitcoin Core, and put forth as kind of universal good, and I've objected because I have a different perspective on things. There's certain assumptions made about implementation that don't hold true in our implementation, right? In other words, we don't have, for example,
give an example? Yeah.
We don't have a memory pool. We don't have a UTXO database, right? Those are two big examples. People think of those as part of Bitcoin.
Right.
They're not. They're part of an implementation that Satoshi created. They're optimizations that, in one sense, can be very detrimental. They're just trade-offs, right? And so when you make changes to behavior to protocol in order to make those easier, and it makes it harder for us, right? It's not a protocol benefit; it's an implementation benefit, and sometimes this benefit to the implementation is because the implementation has its own issues, right? So there's been those type of things which are more just technical, not really behavioral. But then there's some things that are protocol changes that I've had exceptions with, and other people as well, that aren't really about making the development easier. They're about achieving some privacy objective that I don't agree with. I think is at odds with the more important objectives of Bitcoin. So and I get comments privately from people who agree with me, but don't want to come out and say it because that there'll be an outcast in this community. But we don't care, so we can say what we want, right? And that independent voice, even if it's not embraced eventually by the community, is important to have.
Sure.
And that was a big part of what Amir was trying to achieve. And I think from an engineering standpoint, Libbitcoin has done some things that are fascinating and just in some ways they're trade-offs, but in some ways are much better. I'm trying to avoid using this word. It's not about better or worse, right? These are just engineering trade-offs that it can achieve things in a different way that are very interesting.
Yeah.
For example, not having a memory pool. What the problem is, you have a memory pool, you run out of memory, right? And memory is the most expensive resource you have on the computer. So why are you optimizing, to fill up your memory? And then you run into things like spam. People have issues with spam transactions, and you restart your node and you lose the history, and there's all these issues with it. But there's different ways to solve those problems. And yeah, go ahead.
How much use how many people are basically using this implementation?
I have no idea. I don't track it.
Right.
I don't ask for anybody to provide any information. I found entire companies that have built for years on Libbitcoin and then come to me and had a problem, and I did some consulting with them, and I had no idea, but they built a coin, a company, a market, everything, and so they're it's definitely smaller than the Satoshi client, but the objective is not to have the most nodes or be the most wallets, right? We're just trying to provide this developer platform, and people come and use it. And there's companies I know of, they're listed on one of our sites, maybe a dozen or so that are well known, and some that have used it and then moved on to other things because we haven't had for example, if you want to, like, for example, Edge Wallet, which was originally Airbits, right? They were built entirely on Libbitcoin, or at least mostly on Libbitcoin initially, and eventually they branched out and wanted to do other coins, and then they went to, the mobile app. They wanted to work in JavaScript or something that was cross-platform. So I don't even know if they use it anymore. OpenBazaar was another example. OpenBazaar was started by Amir. It was originally a dark market hackathon project at about 5 years ago in Toronto, and he did it with 2 Airbits guys actually. It was all done in Libbitcoin, and then eventually OpenBazaar came along, picked it up, and developed it. Obi-Wan came along and developed it in OpenBazaar. And I remember supporting them for quite a while until eventually, for the same reason or similar reasons, they moved on to using a different toolkit because of the cross-coin support and other issues. And the Bitcoin has not always been mature enough to do things people want to do, so they move on. But so it tends to be very good at some things. It's not a mining platform. I don't encourage people to use it for that. It will be at some point, but it doesn't have the feature completeness that we would need to be able to support mining.
Right.
I don't. So we tend to see a lot of people that are doing wallet stuff. We've had research people come in. They want to build something. But as far as numbers, I don't know. I really just don't care. I don't keep track. I just try to support everybody that comes along.
Sure.
And so does the rest of the team.
Switching it up a little bit, you've been in the space for, I think, as you mentioned, 5-6 years.
About 6 years, yeah.
What right now is the most interesting or concerning or area of focus, aside from the Bitcoin, that you're most kind of engaged in?
I spend most of my time for the past year in crypto economics, not even in code. So I don't know if that's what you're actually asking, but so I have a long, diverse background in different things, and very much a long-term student of economic theory and political theory. Eventually, my understanding of how Bitcoin actually worked evolved to the point where I could connect those things, right? Start making inferences about behavior, and Bitcoin has some unique aspects, some of which tend to get ignored, and others which get a lot of focus. Supply cap gets a lot of focus. Fixed transaction rate doesn't get nearly the focus from, like, maximalists, for example. Right? We can ignore that, but those have interesting economic consequences that people ignore or don't think through.
Yeah.
And I find those things very interesting, so I spend a lot of time, developing and writing proofs on what the behavior actually is. So yeah, that led me to, I have about 95 topics in crypto economics now that are just buried in the Bitcoin wiki, because I had to put them somewhere, and that was easy. And it was basically a way to not have to keep retweeting these things time and time again from scratch. So
yeah, I've read a bunch of them, and I'm gonna break into a couple of them specifically a little bit later on. But in listening to you in certain presentations and other podcasts and stuff, and I want to be careful how I word this, because I want to word it as accurately as possible, because you're obviously a big supporter of this project and this movement, if you want to call it that. But it's very clear that you want to as far as you're concerned, attempt to engage it in the most rational and reality-based way possible. Obviously, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't you? But I think a lot of people in this space, and I'm not actually suggesting they're wrong. I'm not saying that I'm not making that judgment right here. I'm just saying that a lot of people are so excited about the potential of what Bitcoin represents that they become very enthusiastic about a number of its different qualities, and how how those qualities. Sorry?
You might say perceived qualities.
Perceived qualities, yes. And then in conversation with you, those perceptions get challenged, and you kind of come off as this person who rains on the parade a little bit. I know that's not how you see it, because you're
No, I understand that. I completely get that perspective. I do see it that way. It's not my intent.
Right. Sorry.
I wouldn't work in this stuff if I wasn't motivated.
That's what I meant.
By
Yeah.
its potential. But I have a background in multiple backgrounds in real things, that real security. I sold. There's a company out there called Beyond Trust. It keeps growing and whatever. I co-founded that company. It was an IT security company, right? And we had to deal with real security issues. We couldn't just kind of wave our hands at them and say, well, this is not a problem, and then all of a sudden a whole corporate network gets wiped out, right?
Right.
So I have a 10-year background as a military fighter pilot, combat experienced, and Top Gun trained tactics instructor. I evaluated people's tactics, and I'd sit in a brief and watch them go off to mock war, and I would be either fighting with one of them or in the bad guys fighting against them, and I would tell them, you're all going to die, and they would be completely confident that they were fine, and they would all die, because these things are, you can infer things from people's security model. They're planning their unrealistic expectations. 25, 30 years in martial arts, same thing, right? You make assumptions about the other person, and you find out, well, they don't really hold up. So I became very much, with Bitcoin, I became very interested in the things that people would say that there was no basis for, right? Like, no, that's not really provable.
So what's one of the big ones, that you often come up against, that you have to, from your perspective, put some reality on?
Well, the most common one is that Bitcoin is a white market money, right? It's this thing that's just going to exist with permission, even though we call it permissionless. And because it does, because presumably it's not important enough for anybody to care, we assume that that's part of the security model, right? There's nothing, and believe me, I've written enough lines of Bitcoin code to know that there's nothing in there that prevents a law from being passed, right? And there's this assumption that, well, there's something about it, something magical that will prevent that from happening. And I think that's just absolute nonsense. And that's not to say that it will happen. That's to say there's nothing stopping it from happening that is any greater than what stops it from happening in dollars, euros, or any other state money, right? Gold, for example. So there's this belief that it's somehow different in that respect, which is just not the case. Bitcoin's security architecture is completely designed around being able to hide when it's not allowed. That's the security model. Right. That's why we say decentralization. That's why we say anonymity. That's why things being small, being able to keep blocks small, nodes small, be able to operate at small scale. That's so you can hide, right? And if that's not important, then Bitcoin's not important, right? You can just do it out in the open, and it's so popular, nobody would dare pass a law to prohibit it. Then we wouldn't need it, right? So I think that's by far the most common fallacy.
So what is the fallacy, stated more simply?
What is the fallacy?
The fallacy that you were just addressing.
I don't think I have a named fallacy for this. I just call it black market money. This comes down to one of the three security principles that I refer to as cryptodynamics that define what Bitcoin is.
Right, but you're suggesting that people just assume that because of whatever qualities Bitcoin represents, that it will ultimately force itself upon the white market and will have to be adopted by the people that control the white-black line, let's say, via regulation. Is that what you're?
Well, it's already there, right? Bitcoin is widely used in white market stuff, Coinbase, whatever, right?
Sure.
And these are relative terms. They're not judgmental terms, right? Black market is the free market. It's the market that operates without permission.
Right.
It doesn't ask permission, doesn't need permission. It just does what it wants. White market is the market that complies. And even in the white market right now, you see fairly modest controls being applied. I got kicked off of Coinbase. Why? I don't know. But clearly they had no interest in kicking me off. There was some regulatory concern they had. And I tripped some AI program that said this guy's a risk, and so they kicked me off. I had been on there for like 6 years, and maybe I spoke too much. I hadn't changed my behavior. on their system. But yeah, okay, so there's a control being applied, very easily applied. KYC, AML, these are already being applied.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's white market accepting the need to have permission to operate. And Bitcoin has no protection against that. It offered me no protection, right, against that scenario. Now, of course, if I'm running my own node and trading with other people who are running their own nodes, it's the same situation. They can just come up, say, well, if you do that, you're a money launderer unless you get identity and file it on your tax return. And like for example, if the dollar drops and you have a capital gain in Bitcoin, right? Bitcoin purchasing power remains the same, but the dollar gets cut in half. You have a capital gain. Right. You have to pay taxes in the U.S. So if you don't pay those taxes, you're criminal, right? You're a criminal actor.
But doesn't it give you the option to resist that because you can acquire and store it absent, the awareness
Bitcoin
of the regulating authorities?
Yeah, Bitcoin gives you the option to break the law.
Right.
Right. It makes it easier for you to do it. It doesn't make the law harder to pass or impossible to pass.
Sure,
it just makes it easier for you to ignore it.
Right. So
by doing so, you're black market.
Yeah, and
right?
so in the case that you were saying, like if Coinbase cuts you off, Bitcoin doesn't help you, but it's still, it's still this.
No, it's not what I'm saying. I'm saying Bitcoin could do nothing to stop that.
Sure.
Right? It can help me if I'm willing to break the law.
Right. And then
Coinbase is not willing to break the law, even though they're exchanging Bitcoin. Right? Bitcoin doesn't help them in any way.
Right.
Now, if the law was passed that affected me, I would have the same decision to make, right? The law has been passed that affects me. I got to decide whether I'm going to pay that capital gains tax on the loss of purchasing power of fiat, right? And Bitcoin's not saving me from paying signage in fiat because I'm using Bitcoin if I obey the law. I'm still paying signage because I get a capital gains tax when fiat goes down or state fiat goes down, right? So it doesn't protect me against that. It just makes it easier for me to decide that I'm going to protect myself from doing that, right? I'm going to do something. So people still have to make that decision and do that, and that's what I'm saying. If people make that decision to be black market, Bitcoin makes it easier.
Right.
But Bitcoin does not make it easier to be white market, right? It's
and so I understand that, and that so the one point is that Bitcoin provides that option to be black market more so than options in the past, right? The other thing is if we, the difference between the black market and the white market is regulation, right? As you said, the black market is the free market. It's a market that operates absent regulation, and the market forces and dynamics dictate how the market works, whatever they may be. I think one of the arguments that's often made with Bitcoin is that because this option is now available, the more onerous the regulations become. Let's say the state is ends up being more and more oppressive on Bitcoin, wants to stomp it out from more areas, wants to control it more, etc., then you're expanding the surface area of the black market. And will there be a time when if more and more activity gets pushed to the black market, that you're just expanding the mass of the thing that's ultimately competing with the white market? And will that lead to a...
Sure. If under those assumptions, yeah, you're expanding the black market. Black market is massive. I mean, it's by some estimates 20 to 30% of the world's economy, varying quite a bit from region to region based on political controls, but it's pretty big. And, more prohibition pushes more things into the black market.
Exactly.
Right? So that doesn't contradict anything I've said. I've said that Bitcoin is a black market money. Its design is to facilitate money, electronic money specifically, right? We have gold. You can use that privately in the black market, and you can use paper money, right? You use state money privately in the black market.
Right.
But electronic money is something that doesn't exist outside of Bitcoin in the black market, and so it provides this benefit to people who are willing to use it. It provides some, security model in that context. But if people expect to be able to use it in white market transactions and just expect that it will always be permitted, they're just making the assumption that a law won't be passed. And maybe that'll happen. Maybe that'll just be the case. But it's already not the case.
Right. But I think this is, one of the fundamental reasons why people are interested in Bitcoin, because they feel that they at least, it's not the end all be all, of course, you know, it's one of many tools, but I think the hope is that this tool will, you know, if we say the free market instead of the black market, I think people desire freedom to transact, freedom to, you know, freedom in many capacities. And I think what a lot of people hope is that this tool will enable a transition from the black market being an underground, you know, side market to the white market to a more, you know, the dominant market rather than
well,
you know.
if people truly, so people desire freedom for themselves, not for others. And if people
Is that
truly
true
desire,
in all cases?
it's a generalization. Just take it as a postulate, you know, for now, right?
Okay.
Like, if we can assume that people want to do whatever they want to do, which probably a safe assumption, and then if we can also assume that people don't like other people doing, you know, being able to do whatever they want to do, which we can observe in politics, right? If people really wanted money where people could do whatever they wanted with it, then we would already have it, right? They would just obtain it through the political process, but they don't. They have that option, at least in most countries in the world. They have that option to vote the bums out, get their good dollars, and achieve what they want. But so if it's put to a political process, that's not what you get. That's observable. So Bitcoin is more
but
of
that's
an
more
option
of a
for people.
reflection of the political process, you know, not representing maybe the will of the majority, is it not?
I think the political process in many places does represent the will of the majority. If you talk to people on the street and you tell them you're an anarchist and you don't want the political process to do these things, they will reject you. Well, 99 times out of 100.
That's true.
So
that's true.
People are very keen on their own liberty, but they're very afraid of everybody else's. And the political process is nothing but some subset of that population fighting to obtain control over other people. And I don't find it a very popular idea that everybody should be able to do what they want as long as they're not aggressing other people. So Bitcoin gives the people that want to do what they want the option to opt out of that system. And, you know, we tend to be a minority.
How much do you think education is involved in that? You know, because I agree, like, you know, you ask the average person on the street, you know, should just, let's use the Bitcoin example, right? Like, you know, wouldn't Bitcoin be a freer money, not as manipulatable, able to be influenced by the powers that be, the state, the international bankers, etc. And you find that they would say, no, I want to, you know, the dollar is fine. But a lot of that is probably because
you want to be free to buy your drugs online, or your, you know,
right,
whatever,
right.
And then people start freaking out, right? Money laundering, and this is, you know, if we don't all pay our taxes, how are we going to get all these things we like? So people, you know,
so being informed is a huge component of this.
Provable. This is just something that's observable. Is that if you wanted a money that was secured politically, which is what people are actually saying when they say they can't pass a law, right? It's secured politically. We already have that. The status quo is very evident. There is no country on earth where, you know, that I'm aware of that actually has obtained that politically. So to believe that because of some technology we're now going to just magically obtain that politically is a bit naive. But it could happen. Again, I don't rule it out. But the security architecture of Bitcoin has nothing to do with that. It provides the ability for people to operate at relatively small scale, hide, and do things relatively anonymously. And that's why we talk about decentralization, anonymity, and privacy.
Right. But just to extend,
from a system security standpoint.
To extend that for 1 second, and then we can break more into what you're just referencing. A lot. Yeah, I know this isn't provable, but you know, just for the sake of this discussion, my experience has been in speaking with people. A lot of people that come into the Bitcoin space either come in as a result of kind of understanding better how the system works, or how money works, or the financial system, political system, or as a result of engaging in Bitcoin, they kind of begin to go down the educational rabbit hole. They start reading about economics and money and things like that, and they start to change their views. So that's kind of the representation of how kind of their will is changing as a result of being more informed, being more educated, thoughtful about this subject. So
that's a certain percentage of the population, but there's also just pure speculation.
Right, of course,
yeah,
of course.
It's a casino, right? And
absolutely.
we always win.
Yeah, I agree. But what I'm saying is, so like if we want a freer system, if we want a money that has the qualities that I think we feel that Bitcoin represents, is not one of the major, I guess, objectives, and as a community or as an individual,
Yep.
to educate people so that they're informed, so that they can see why it might be an avenue toward greater freedom or liberty or freer markets or things like that. Like, is that, Bitcoin is, again, just a tool. It doesn't represent the solution in itself, but if what we're,
Yeah.
is education the big part of this, so that people actually, the will of the people, if we're saying that the will of the people is represented in the political structure and the system that we have, is our job then to change the will of the people by having them be more informed and educated about the reality of this thing?
First of all, there's no entity, the people, right? There's just individual persons. And this is an abstraction that states like, because they like to express the idea that they're expressing the will of this one entity called the people.
Right.
So individuals have their own personal objectives and desires, and Bitcoin allows them to do this or not do this. But education about the tax effects of money, which is really what we're talking about, right? Money is a great tax vehicle, state money. And in some parts of the world, they're keenly aware of this. In the West, they tend not to be, because the tax is not nearly as high or as visible. So you don't have to educate people, in Zimbabwe or Venezuela anymore about the tax effects of money. It's the West that suffers under that delusion.
But perhaps educating them about the implications of that would maybe enhance the gravity of that realization. For example,
sure.
I was just going to say, people understand, the tax effect, but they might not realize the degree to which that influences, military operations or imperialism
taxes
or that
pay
kind
the
of
bills,
stuff.
right?
Right.
So that's
but it's not always evident, right? People sometimes need to be told.
Some people but some people like those aspects. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing it, right? Those things generate votes, and so they're done. Military actions or social benefits, whatever, those are all done for votes, at least in the West, and they're done to keep the king's head on his shoulders in other parts of the world, but which is essentially votes, right?
You think military action is done for votes?
Sure. If people were all against it, it would be unlikely to happen, right? You take a dictatorship and the things that they do, which are pretty common, hand out social benefits to try to keep people happy, try to find them some jobs. These are very common in third world countries, different parts of the world, because that's what keeps the king in power, right? Or the dictator. And that's essentially pitchforks are a form of voting. So
right.
So people, keep people content, and they'll be less likely to overthrow you or vote you out, per se. So these things are done for political popularity.
Yeah, you saying, I'm not sure if I can agree with that. I do understand what you're saying, but I feel like when you said that, it made me think, like, I don't think that many people are for, non-defensive war, but I feel like it's become so, I think there's an apathy where people just feel like, well, this is going to happen regardless of if I vote in a Democrat or Republican, this guy or that guy. And, I feel like maybe there's a narrative here about people's kind of sense of powerlessness.
There's a reason they think it's going to happen is because it's going to happen, because it's popular enough to happen. If you're not around people that are like pro-military action, it's just you're living in some kind of bubble. There's a lot of those people, right? And a lot of them in the U.S. and around the world. And one of the reasons why you see states will promote a conflict for months, if not years ahead of time, right, is to get the people behind it. And there are many conflicts that are not engaged in because they're just not popular. We have this concept of an unpopular war. I mean, when Vietnam became unpopular enough, it ended, right? That's what did it, and it was very popular before. The actions that were being taken were, anti-communist. They were, containment, right? There were plenty of lies, but in the end, there was a lot of support. I mean, and then things changed and it ended. So if you can't, in Vietnam, that was the opposing strategy, right? Was to take away the popularity of the war in the U.S., which was in some ways very effective. So to think that these conflicts go on because they're just, somebody, who has power, who's been put in office, who just wants to do it and nobody else wants it is not realistic. People actually do promote these things. And when they become popular enough, that's when they happen.
I think that popularity is probably expressed in inaction, you know. So, and I agree. Like, if
that's consent,
right, exactly. And so, if you know, in that capacity, I agree that, you know, people just, you can say, this is you know, going back to what you say versus what you do, right? People will say they have a preference for a lot of different things, or they support a lot of different things. What does the behavior dictate you're willing to tolerate or you're not willing to tolerate? And this can come from a managerial perspective in a business, or from a political perspective, or, you know, many different perspectives. And that, you know, and I think that's a pretty maybe complex issue, because I think a lot of people would say that, you know, they don't feel they have an avenue to express their support or lack thereof for something, or one that has any impact. I think a lot of people would say that.
It's because they don't, because they're not a member of the people, right? Everybody has their own perspectives and opinions, and they're not representable, right? It boils down to one decision in the end, and that can't not possibly represent everybody's perspective. So people have accepted this idea that if the majority or whoever can get enough power together does something, then it's the good, right? And that is not the that's not the Bitcoin perspective. The Bitcoin perspective is I'm opting out of this, right? I'm not consenting. I'm not voting for it. I'm just leaving,
right?
And that's, you know, that's my personal philosophy on anarchism, right? It's really not about forcing everybody else to go along with what I want, or, you know, tearing down institutions. It's just about not participating in things I don't want to support.
Right.
I mean, I wouldn't go to my neighbor's house, put a gun in their face, and say, "Give me your stuff because I want to make a school." But people vote for that in my town, right? Regularly. So I don't vote, and therefore I'm not participating. You know, I pay my taxes because otherwise, you know, I'll be the one with the gun in my face. So there's compliance, and then there's active compliance. And when you're voting, you're actively complying. You're lending your support, your voice to whatever conclusion the system comes to. And then you say you don't have a voice. Well, you just gave your voice to the system. You supported it. You supported the idea that whatever people decide is what will happen.
Right.
So, you know, this idea that somehow everybody's idea could be represented in a representative democracy is just, you know, patently false, right?
Sure.
It can't be.
But that's why the enthusiasm and interest in Bitcoin, right? Because it actually, seemingly, I think, for a lot of people who may have felt helpless, may have felt that, you know, nothing represented their voice or their preferences, it provides, as you just mentioned, an opt-out, you know, like an active opt-out, where before it was, you know, you were complying in some capacity. This provides you a way to, you know, maybe comply less and start contributing to another system that you would maybe prefer to, you know, to engage in.
Yeah, that's very consistent with what I believe. I mean, Bitcoin is it's just an option to leave and do what you want, whether you like programming money, which is not allowed. You know, you think it's kind of technical, right? But I want to do this, and you can't do it. Why can't you do it with PayPal APIs or what? You know, because it's not allowed.
Yeah.
You know, so people who want to do what they want to do and it's not allowed, they opt out. They become part of the black market. They don't comply. So that's not, you know, that's what I've told people. What I see in the security model is that Bitcoin is not something that is going to sit around. If it becomes important enough, the state will care and it will say no. And now we will, you know, but it's permissionless. It doesn't need permission. Well, it turns out that, you know, if you want to accept it at McDonald's or, you know, your bookstore or your online service, you're either going to, you know, take the risk of walking out in handcuffs, or you're going to be, or you're going to comply. You're going to take, you know, you're going to switch a couple of your rules, make it into FedCoin, and then you'll be compliant. But Bitcoin doesn't offer any security against that. People have to individually resist, and the best way to, you know, the most effective way to resist the state is to hide. And so that's the Bitcoin security model. Is you can do this at small scale, and you can do, you know, therefore no centralized services. That's why decentralization, right? It's small scale operation.
Yeah. So Bitcoin's integration into the quote-unquote white market is entirely dependent on the good graces of the state, right? I understand
that. Seems self-evident, right?
Right, right, of course.
Right. So as long as we're in those good graces, it's all good.
But is it possible that, and this literally just came to my mind, but we were talking about kind of the impact of being informed and being educated on the will of the people, and the will of the people impacting this, you know, political state that we get. You know, if it becomes so integrated, and it actually represents a force for people, and I kind of hate this term because it could be misconstrued in many ways, but quote unquote waking up to the state of affairs. Do you think? So
you're asking me what could happen, right?
Yeah, sure.
And
you don't like speculating.
No, I just don't, right? Because you don't know what's going to happen, and I don't know what's going to happen.
Right, but it's sometimes fun to talk about it.
Yeah, it is. But I take exception with people that make you know, predictions as if these are facts, right? So we could say that people becoming more educated about money would have this result. Yes, it could be true. It could have no impact whatsoever, except to, you know, create more of a burdensome, you know, regulatory environment because the state's afraid of it. Who knows, right? All I can say is that it's possible, not provable, that Bitcoin can operate without permission if people are willing to both take the risk of doing it, and if they're willing to pay for it, because it will become expensive to operate if the state is trying to suppress it. Right. More expensive than, you know, it might be independently.
So do you have a hope or vision for Bitcoin?
Yeah, Bitcoin works right now, and I wanted to do more of what it does, allowing people to do things if they want to without, you know, having to ask permission. Moving money across borders, you know, is a nice benefit of Bitcoin, and it's very easily doable right now. You know, electronic movement of money is the feature, the value proposition is avoidance of tax, and it does it quite well. It might be more difficult, you know, under state-sponsored 51% attack, but it is possible for Bitcoin to survive that. It's just not provable whether it will. Right. So yeah, my hope is that more people will use it in a way that can survive those kind of attacks. But I know they won't unless it matters. So some people have to kind of continue to develop things along those lines and resist an evolution of Bitcoin into a system that can't survive those types of situations. Right. So a lot of the core devs understand this very well. It's why they resist big blocks. It's why they resist, you know, why they work primarily on anonymity. Right? It's the major thrust of Bitcoin development right now is enhancing anonymity and privacy. It's essential. You know, Bitcoin is pretty weak in those respects, and being able to hide is central to the value, you know, to the value proposition, to be able to avoid paying that tax.
Right. And so sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't advocate people do one thing or the other. I make tools and let people do what they want to do. And people ask me, what should people do? I think, well, you should do whatever they want to do. That's the whole point. Right. If they don't want to use this, they should go use something else. But, you know, I think it's a decision that each individual person should be able to make, and we make the tools so that they can more effectively make that decision.
But why do you want more people to use this, or for this to exist, to continue to exist and expand? Like, you want to avoid paying taxes to the state. You want to avoid. I want people to be able to make that decision individually. Right. Well, what's your individual decision? Like, why do you, like?
I like people being able to make their own decisions because I'm an advocate of human liberty.
Right, but if we don't say people, we say Eric. Like, why does Eric want a black market money to exist?
Because Bitcoin is a black market money. It's only securable in that context. So if I'm going to work on Bitcoin, that's what I'm going to work on, right?
But I don't even mean in terms of working on it. I mean,
why should a black market money exist? So people can do things that they want that are peaceful and they don't want to ask for permission to do.
Right.
And you know, some people only think of this in the context of the West. I mean, there's plenty to complain about there. But you know, you go to some very oppressive regimes, and people are just trying to survive, and it's very difficult to do. And you know, I like to help those people to the extent I can.
Sure. No, I get that. I mean personal motivations for using it rather than, you know, working in it, engaging it, building it, developing it, you know. as a, you know, anarchist, what are, you know, the personal motivation for just being able to use this in your life?
For the same reasons for as everybody else who would use it. You know, I'm not going to go into any details, but you know, Bitcoin has certain value propositions that are useful in different scenarios. And I mean, I use Bitcoin to buy some tickets or whatever, buy a beer, send some money to somebody across the country. It's just easier if we're all working in Bitcoin. So I use it like that plenty. But you know, there are other cases where you want privacy, you want anonymity. You don't, you know, you're doing something illegal. You want to be able to opt out. Yeah. And, you know, send some money across the border. I mean, shit, how do you ever try to send money to Iran? You know, buy like try to go on a trip in Iran, and you can't use your credit cards, you can't send them money, and you got to, you know, book some hotels, whatever. We went through this a few years ago, and basically you have to hire a travel agent on faith, you know, hire them, and they book everything for you. They take all the upfront costs, and they hope you show up and pay them, right, in cash, because that's the only way you can do it, right? So I was thinking at the time, and if I could just send them some Bitcoin, you know, it'd be a heck of a lot easier. I wouldn't have to worry about these currency controls that are in place. But we didn't, and we didn't do the trip because we weren't sure we could make it in time, couldn't get the visa in time, so we didn't want to have them take all the risk of fronting all the stuff and then losing it. So we said, sorry, we'll try again another time.
Right.
But those things happen all the time, and Bitcoin, you know, Bitcoin makes that easier. Of course, that qualifies as, you know, money laundering or evasion of currency controls. Those are American currency controls. So, you know, everybody's willingness to do that is based on their own risk tolerance. And the more visible you are, the harder it gets. So I avoid some of those things, you know, because I don't want to take the risk. But I want people to be able to do so if they're willing and if it's maybe necessary.
So basically, Bitcoin facilitates more activity in the black market. And the black market is basically the market where there's a set of activities that people want to engage in that are not permitted by the state or the regulatory thing, the regulatory machine. And so Bitcoin is facilitating people basically to, it's making it easier to be an outlaw, to put it a little bit dramatically.
Yeah, but there's more to it than that. It's like, you know, there's this distinction between Bitcoin itself being outlaw money and being an outlaw activity, and Bitcoin supporting outlaw activity. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about Bitcoin as a black market money, what I'm not saying specifically that Bitcoin exists so that people can go do crimes, other types, right? Other types of prohibited activity. What I'm saying is that Bitcoin's security model is designed so that it can operate when it's not allowed. Even if you're just, you know, going out of the store and buying some coffee, right? It's not allowed to do with Bitcoin, right? But you can do it if you want to. And so it's designed to survive when it's not allowed. Right. But because of that, right, and because of other properties it has as a consequence of that, it tends to be more useful when you're doing other things that are not allowed as well, right?
Yeah, and like you said, I mean, we already have a politically sanctioned money. So the fact that, you know, it's currently allowed in the white market, I mean, who really cares? This is designed to facilitate activity in the unregulated, the black market, right?
Well, so not the unregulated, right? The unpermitted, right?
Right. Sure. The one that's not, the unpermitted, the black market.
They're both regulated. Right? It's just that the distinction is not
who's doing the regulating.
No, the distinction is who's obeying, right? You have the set of regulations that apply to the market, right? All of it. And then you have a subset of people who refuse to obey those controls. That's the black market, right? Right. It's not a different set of regulations, right? For example, you can get heroin legally, right? You can get most illicit drugs legally under the right circumstances or under the circumstances. Even during alcohol prohibition, you could, as a church, you could get alcohol for services, and you know, these are not ever completely prohibited, not usually, but it's kind of this continuous spectrum, and at some point people say, I'm just going to do it anyway. Right. Now their black market.
Sure.
It's not that the substance is black market. It's not that the act is black market. It's that the people are refusing to comply.
Yeah,
pay the tax.
Right. So I guess my point was just that the fact that it's being integrated into the white market in certain instances right now, it's like you've said this before, that we already have a, you know, politically sanctioned money, you know, so it doesn't really do much for people operating in that market. it's designed for the people want to operate in the black market, right? So
yeah, that's what it's designed for, but it can function in either as long as it's allowed.
Well,
and that's what we have now. It's largely functional in most places. And
right, but my point is just like
market.
people don't, you know, the revolutionary aspect of this thing that a lot of people feel like nobody really gives a shit that there's another sanctioned currency in the world. There's hundreds of them, and we don't really have you know, it doesn't advance things in the eyes of people that are looking at it from a revolutionary perspective that much. We're looking at it from the way that it disintermediates those political monies, right? It provides more freedom for activity that's more difficult to control. It facilitates the exchanges in the black market.
Yeah. And people, a lot of people just don't, especially people that are speculating, right? They want to see mass adoption. They want to see everybody in the white market pull it up. So they let that's a very different perspective on Bitcoin. If you're speculating on price growth, you don't care about, maybe you do care about both, right? But I think it tends to blind people to the reality of what Bitcoin actually is. And that's why we see, splits in the community. Some of them, right, are a consequence of this issue. Like Mike Hearn decided, he actually explicitly said, you can't defeat the state, so I'll go work on R3, right? Once you decide that, I call it the axiom of resistance. You have to assume that that's possible. You can't prove it, but if you assume that it's possible, then you might work on Bitcoin. If you assume it's not possible, you absolutely wouldn't. Like, why would you bother?
Yeah, I think a lot of people in the space are probably hoping that as the economic mass of Bitcoin grows, the price will increase, so the value of their holdings will go up, and the fact that more people are engaging in it, it has a larger economic mass, it will be able to resist the state more effectively the larger it gets. Do you have
that's hope as a security model, right? Yeah, maybe that happens, but you can't prove that, right? It's just a political argument, right? Maybe people will vote for a money like Bitcoin. But again, if they wanted that, they could have that already.
But one of the things you mentioned,
maybe the educational aspect of it will be enough for people to wake up and realize, oh, we really want sound money, but I tend to avoid that term, but we want money that's not so heavily taxed. But once they realize that, why don't they just vote for a better dollar, right? You could achieve that with the dollar. It's a hope. It's not something you can demonstrate or that we observe.
Right.
It didn't happen with gold, which is an extremely popular money, around the world for centuries. And then all of a sudden it was illegal to use in transactions and or for pricing transactions. And then when electronic money became kind of the de facto standard, those prohibitions went away because they're not really relevant anymore. So yeah, the idea that, oh, it's so popular, and everybody holds their wealth in it, therefore nobody could possibly make a slight change to it to add, say, an inflation rule so that state can now have monetary policy, or that they could add a censorship regime so the state can now see what everybody's doing. But those two relatively tiny changes to the code, it's a perfect money for the state. And I'm pretty sure that a lot of the white market so-called Bitcoin businesses would embrace those if it meant regulatory certainty and safety from the risks that they think they might be taking otherwise. So, and people would still see it as Bitcoin. I call it Fedcoin, right? So we make these changes, now it's the perfect money. But without those changes, the state is relinquishing a major tax vehicle. So people might want it, but people who want a state that has money and the state's going broke, they might say, well, people are laundering all their money, and we need to, and this was what happens when any currency is failing, right? You blame the speculators, you pose price controls, currency controls. We went through this whole progression in Venezuela over a period of like a decade, where the people actually embraced those arguments, right? They blamed the speculators, the people who are raising their prices, the people who are hoarding, right? These are all a consequence of the taxes that are being applied to the money, and the consequences of those, surface in a certain way, and then those become the evils. And so people come along and say, well, yeah, it's all this money laundering that's going on with Bitcoin. It's all this tax evasion. Let's blame those people. So you already see these arguments being made, right? There's regular, very obvious statements being made at the political level that this money laundering, won't stand.
Right.
And if people if people didn't agree with that, they would simply, vote those people out and say, no, Bitcoin's great. But again, it comes down to a political vote, which we already have the power to do.
Yeah, but the total value of, let's say, the economic mass of Bitcoin continues to grow despite these detractors, despite these arguments. So I guess what I was referring to was, if that trend continues, because you've mentioned before, like the state could very easily attack Bitcoin in one centralized location, get enough hash power to 51% it, and then it really becomes a battle of fees and how much tax money the state is willing to use to subsidize their, the discrepancy between.
Presumably before they do that, they just simply pass a law that says, Bitcoin is money laundering. If you do it, you're going to jail, right? Then that wipes out the entire white market. Anybody who doesn't want to operate illegally, and then when that doesn't fully, achieve sufficient results, then you move on to a 51% attack against the black market. And this may be individual countries, right? There may be whole countries that are like cool with it, and so they're just from the authority that cares, right? From their perspective, they're just rogue nations. They're just part of the black market, right?
Right.
So it really only matters at that point whether there's enough economic power in the black market to overpower that control.
Right.
And that's not really knowable.
Right. That's what I was referring to.
Yeah. But I was just pointing out that you kind of skipped over the most easy and obvious step, which is just sign a piece of paper and say it's money laundering. Yeah,
and then this goes to the speculation, argument, discussion, whatever you want to call it, of to what degree, if that came to pass in the future, to what degree do people have the capacity and the willingness to resist? And this might get a little bit dark here, but another thing I've noticed in the Bitcoin community is that there's a lot of gun supporters. Because I think people are inherently realizing that should push come to shove, as it were, Bitcoin, yes, is a tool that facilitates a lot of things, but it's not a perfect tool. It doesn't solve all the problems, and it certainly doesn't resist the power of the state on an individual level. And I think this is why a lot of people in Bitcoin are kind of recognizing the importance of being able to resist. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to be comfortable and willing to do that, because that's a very heavy decision that has a lot of implications. We have seen examples in history of people, as you mentioned, the pitchfork scenario, where people were willing to take the risk to, their life effectively to resist because they believe so strongly that a change need to occur. But I think that's an interesting component of Bitcoin that I've seen in almost all of my discussions with people, is that there's a recognition that being able to resist on an individual level to that type of state intervention, it may become important.
It'd be essential. I mean, if you want to operate, once it's not allowed, you have to resist, right? You are resisting, and that may come down to So security in all things comes down to humans taking actual risk, right, to their persons, and that's something that people ignore in Bitcoin a lot. Like, it's the crypto that provides the security. That's just nonsense. It's just like a gun. It's a tool that makes it easier for you, or somehow facilitates you taking that risk, but you're still taking that risk. And some people recognize that and realize that if they're going to continue to do this, they're going to have to defend themselves. But the idea of individuals defending themselves from the state with guns is fairly naive. So
why is that?
In mass, because they tend to go to jail or get killed. It does happen throughout history.
Right.
Things, not on an individual basis, right? You get Ruby Ridge or something, right? You don't get. So we're talking about, wholesale revolution. Yeah, possible, but that's not individual Bitcoiners deciding they're going to protect their node from, forced rule changes or go to jail. And also I'd point out that there's plenty of people in the Bitcoin community who are anti-gun people, right? They're kind of so this idea that everybody agrees, right, on the appropriate powers of the state is just kind of a mythology, right? We kind of live in a little Bitcoin bubble, but there's a vast amount of the population in a lot of countries around the world that are just totally anti-gun, right? They've been taught that that the state is their protector. There are vast amounts of populations around the world, including the U.S., where they believe strongly in what we call social benefits, right? Taking from some people to give to other people forcibly. right?
Sure.
And then we start talking about tearing that down, right? And no, that's not what they want. So other people might want to opt out of that. And, Bitcoin gives them somewhat of an option to do that. But this idea that there's a one people that has this voice is mythology. It's just everybody fighting for control over other people.
Yeah. No, I wasn't suggesting everyone has this one voice. I was just pointing out that in history, a groups of people have come together to make big political change, right? It does happen, and
it doesn't just happen because they want their Bitcoin one day. That happens because they're starving, right? And Russian Revolution, French Revolution, maybe not quite so much the American Revolution, but still onerous taxation, oppressive laws. Right.
Well, this goes back to what we were just saying earlier. It gets to the point where people actually decide through their behavior, not through a stated preference of any kind, that they are unwilling to tolerate any longer the existing, political apparatus of the state.
Historically, that's goes quite a bit further than what we currently see in the West. Right?
Sure,
and you get to a place like Cuba, North Korea. That's pretty oppressive, right? I mean, North Korea especially, and still. They're still there. I mean, if they all rose up at the same time and decided to overthrow the state, including maybe, the army, they could do it easily, but they don't. And the idea that they just will because they learned a little bit about economics is, I think a little bit far-fetched.
Yeah,
right?
Sure. And I'm not really suggesting
I'm not ruling it out.
Yeah. I'm more thinking out loud that in all of these examples of revolution, at some point there was a point where a group of individuals, however large, whatever it was, became aware of a level of oppression, and their unwillingness to tolerate that level of oppression exceeded their desire to maintain comfort and security and status quo, and therefore the action, and therefore whatever result manifested from it. And so I'm not saying that Bitcoin is going to red pill everybody, but things like Bitcoin seem to have a capacity for revealing the oppression that the state is carrying out. Whereas before maybe there wasn't kind of that focal point that shined the light on it. Something like Bitcoin seems to at least be a light to say to reveal more oppression once you learn more about it. And who knows, maybe that will have no impact whatsoever.
Yeah.
Maybe it will be an impetus for behavior change.
I mean, you're preaching to the choir. I mean, this is sometimes we get on these discussions and I'm pointing out the flaws in various theories, but I mean, that is a hope of mine that people will become more aware of what they're paying, how things really work. But ultimately, you can't show that will have any real benefit to individuals or collectively. You can't really know that, right? It might happen, it might not. But what we can know is that an individual person that goes and uses it can get some benefit from it. And to me, right now, that's enough. And if more people can do that, that's even better. The other potential benefits, there's other consequences, right? If the state is not able to stop it and it's taking tax money away and people are realizing what's happening, the tax just shifts to somewhere else, right? It's not as if the state doesn't collect the maximum amount of tax that it can collect. The tax may therefore become more visible because it's not coming through the money. Okay, that might lead to people becoming more aware of themselves being taxed. I mean, in colonial American days, the old tarred and feathered tax man was a real thing. The guy, a local usually they were all Brits or they're all UK citizens, would get a contract from the crown to go and collect the taxes, and he was personally liable for that amount of money being paid. So he had to go get it, right? And he would get it by going door to door and taking stuff from people if he had to, and that eventually, led to some real conflict. The first rebellion in the United States, the Whiskey Rebellion, was actually a fairly major conflict for the day. George Washington getting up on his horse as president, riding out into the mountains to put down a rebellion because people didn't want to pay their tax, on their whiskey for the war, and they had to set a precedent, right? So when the tax becomes visible, people tend to resist more, and maybe they just resist by voting. who knows? But those are all tangential, effects that are just guesses, right?
Yeah.
We can say, well, maybe this would happen. So I like to, these are all potential things. To me, it's better for things to be more open and people to be more aware of what they're paying, and maybe it has that effect. But I like to focus on what we know is going to happen, what under this circumstance, this is how it works. I don't, for example, like, the idea that the security model is based on hope, right? The way Bitcoin works is we all hope that they don't pass the law, and we all hope it gets big enough that it somehow be impossible to pass a law. And so we focus all of our effort on that instead of building something we know is part of the security model, which is making it more anonymous, making it able to operate at small scale, make it easier for people to do things under those circumstances. And we know that that allows people to operate in a situation where it's not even allowed if they choose to. Hope being the security model of Bitcoin to me is just not a very rational thing.
Yeah,
right?
I think most people would even I think they'd push back on admitting that hope was their fundamental perspective on the security model of Bitcoin. Now maybe their behavior would imply something else, but I think most people would not ascribe to that. They realize that that's probably not a very strong approach. But I wanted to ask you about this, kind of related to all this. Another narrative is the existing monetary financial system is crumbling before our eyes. There's this system that we're building in tandem to that. So
how is it crumbling before our eyes? I would just like to take the assumptions and open them up a little bit.
Sure. And again, I'm trying to articulate a narrative that I hear a lot, right? But what I guess what people would say is that I guess it's just the system has more debt than it's ever had, and that the government is having to monetize a lot of that debt, and whether it shows up in inflation or in extra taxation or.
So the system has debt, right? What's
right.
the system? Is it me? Is it you? What is the system that has debt?
I guess the legacy financial system. The white market financial system.
Somebody holds the debt, right? Somebody holds an obligation to somebody else to pay back, right? So this amount of debt we're talking about has to be held by somebody. The question is, who's holding it, right? These are just assumptions people make. These are vague concepts they put out there. Well, debt is credit, right? They're the same thing. Somebody has the credit, somebody has the debt.
Uh-huh.
And credit is lending your money or your capital to producing things, right? Whether it's producing some psychic value benefit of you living in a nice house or producing products, whatever. That's the purpose of it. Without credit, there's no production whatsoever, right? Something has to be lent to somebody for some amount of time. Some money has to be burned before you can produce anything, right?
Yeah.
So credit is the sole source of production. So you could say that in a system with a lot of debt, which means a lot of credit, you have a system that has low time preference and a lot of production. So right off the bat, you have to ask yourself, are we talking about an inherent evil here, right?
Okay,
just in a free market concept, right? Without the state, without anything, just the concept of debt, right?
But does it matter how that's created? Like if you can just, what's your opinion, I guess, right now on the U.S., creating.
How is debt created? Somebody has some capital. Somebody gives it to somebody else in exchange for future returns, promise of future returns. That's how it's created. That capital gets consumed in production, right, or consumption. Which everything that exists is consumed, whether it's in production or in production of psychic, value, as we call it. So all things that exist are constantly being depreciated. They're being consumed, and production required to replenish them. And when you have greater production than depreciation, you have growth. Without production, you have nothing.
Yeah. Maybe you can provide some clarity on this for me, because maybe I don't have it squared properly in my mind. But let's just take like a concrete, firm example of what happens today in the U.S., where the government issues debt. They get, Federal Reserve notes in exchange. That dynamic, what is that dynamic in your view? And what?
Well, I can explain to you the process at a high level.
Sure.
And go down into lower levels, which probably bore all your listeners, but
the process. I think the reason why I ask is I think most people see that as questionable, but you seem to be saying it's a perfectly normal market dynamic.
Well, the market is the market. It rules everything. The market always functions. You have forces applied that shift decisions people make. They're still making market decisions. These forces in a free market, right, are the voluntary choices people make. In a market where you have an aggressor like the state, a major aggressor that people either accept or they don't, then you have what people call them distortions, right? But the market's still functioning. It's just this thing all of a sudden got cheaper, right? The debt, borrowing money got cheaper, or buying a house got cheaper, whatever, right? So getting a job got cheaper because governments is hiring people to dig ditches or something. So prices change as a consequence of taxes, and therefore people's behavior changes because of market forces, right? So when you're talking about the free market, right, and people fail to isolate these two concepts: a free market behavior from intervention in the free market, where you have an aggressor who's stealing from people. Right? Free market behavior. You take a look at the amount of debt, right? That's a consequence, and really, generally, it's a consequence of one thing and one thing only: people's time preference. Time preference is the distinction between what you hoard and what you lend. That percentage, that ratio, which we call interest, or the economic rate of return, whatever you want to call it, is the consequence of people's willingness to lend in the free market. And the amount of debt, so say everybody reserves at 10% and lends 90% of their capital. The amount of debt will be 9 times the amount of capital. That's it. I mean, assuming infinitely small loans all the way down to 0, you get 9 times the amount of credit slash debt as you have capital, and you get growth, or you get production as a consequence of that at a certain rate. And so the difference between that and the rate things depreciate is your economic growth. So people's time preference changes. You get, if it increases or decreases, you're going to get a different amount of credit in the system. But that's it. That's the source of the amount of debt. So some people will go around saying, well, low time preference, that's great, right? We want low time preference because that means that we're producing more things, or creating more value. But then the same people will go around and say, oh, debt, it's awful, right? Well, low time preference means high debt. That's what it means. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. Debt in itself is necessary. Credit and money go hand in hand. Yeah. And without credit, there's no production. And then credit and debt are the same thing.
But what happens when people can create the debt out of thin air? They can't.
They can't. It's just a physical impossibility, right? I can issue you a loan, I'll lend you something, and I just did it out of thin air. Here, you've got $100. Go do with it whatever you want. I just did it out of thin air. Okay? What consequences does it have? None whatsoever, because you don't actually have $100, right? I just said it.
But isn't that what the state does?
No, that's not what the state does. That's
so
not what banks do.
Let's bring it back to the current example of how the state issues debt and how that dynamic works.
First, let's look at how banks do it, because people pin this on the free market. They blame banks just for creating debt, right? That's not what banks do. I could be a bank, and I can say, okay, I'll create 2 accounts. One for I'm gonna lend you some money, and maybe I don't even have any money because I'm just creating debt out of thin air, as they say, right? I have no money, but I'm going to create 2 accounts. One's my debt account. In other words, it represents the money you owe me, and the other account is your credit account. It's the money that you have, right? And call me a bank. I've done nothing but create 2 accounts, and this is what people mean when they say creating out of thin air. They look at those 2 accounts. They're offsetting accounts. Now you have credit, right? Created out of thin air. But we can't settle that debt. It's not settlable because as soon as you go to withdraw your $100, you find out that there's nothing there, right? Well, what if we just all spend it within the system, right? And nobody ever settles. Well, if nobody ever settles, then the credit is actually the money, right? It's not settled. So people don't look at the settlement process, right? The settlement, the need to settle, like when you go to an ATM and you take out cash, you take out dollars, right? You're settling part of your account. When a Brinks truck drives across town and moves some money from one place to another, they're settling accounts. It's the settlement that makes everything work. And if if I just open up an account and I say, yeah, you've got $100 in my credit account, and you go to settle, you can't. You go spend it to somebody else. He gets $100 in his credit account, some other bank, and then the bank says, okay, send me my money. And I'm like, I don't have any money, right? I'm out of business, and this doesn't happen anymore. So that's actually what people believe is that the money is just the credit, because they don't understand the distinction between money and credit and the necessary relationship, the duality between money and credit. So first you have to understand that you can't create credit out of nothing except with no ability to settle, which makes it worthless. So then you inject the state into this process, and what the state does, the mechanics of it are fairly convoluted, but the simple story is it all comes back to the ability to print, literally to print the dollars.
Right.
And in the U.S., the Treasury can print anything it wants and sell. It sells dollars to the Federal Reserve exclusively. It has a list of prices for the dollars on its website. I think it's 5.5 cents per dollar bill, and the price goes up slightly per bill up to a $100 note. And so there's a discount. The Fed goes, and when the Fed wants some dollars, it just literally goes to the Treasury and says, print me, $100 million, and it pays, I forget what the number is, but if it's doing dollar bills, it would take a 94.6% discount on that amount of money. Now it's got that money, right? It just purchased it, right? It paid for it and it got it. and now it can take that money and lend it out to people, right? So
but it paid for it at a 95% discount, right? So
absolutely,
where's the 95% of value coming from?
It's a tax. It's coming from everybody else that holds the money.
Right.
Okay, so they taxed everybody. Okay, it's just a tax, right?
Right.
So they taxed everybody who's holding the money. It's called signage. It's as old as the hills. Everybody knows how it works. The governments even account for it as signage. They're like, oh, if we did this, we'd lose this amount of signage. And what happens is, as inflation takes hold in the money becomes worth less, and over time, that discount goes to get smaller and smaller and smaller until it costs 95 cents to print a dollar bill, or $1 to print a dollar bill, or even $1.10 to print a dollar bill. And what happens then? That bill goes away. And you see this all over the world, right? You go to Thailand at 20 baht is the smallest you can get. You go to Vietnam, 1,000 dong is the smallest you can get. You go to Zimbabwe at one point, 100 trillion, Zimbabwe dollars on one note. That's why, right? Because the discount is going away because of inflation. So, and it's interesting, if you actually look at the time when they went away, that's right about when it happens, when they become as costly to print. So the discount is necessary. The discount is a tax, and the tax accrues to who? Accrues to the state. So the Federal Reserve in the U.S. buys these notes at a discount and then settles with them, right? Lends them out, whatever. Now, they may actually, the way it actually works is a little bit different than that, but before I go into that, it's important to understand that the profit that the Federal Reserve makes in lending and then collecting interest on these notes that have been purchased at a discount is remitted back to the Treasury every year, right? So whatever profit the Fed makes, it writes a check to the Treasury. So the Treasury provides the discount and then reaps the benefits. So that's setting aside all the operations on Treasury bills, Treasury note. That's a whole other process. It's very similar in its behavior, but just set that aside for a bit, right? And just looking at the money itself. So what actually happens is when a bank wants to issue a loan, it has to have a certain amount in reserve, and typically it's around 10%. And that means it has to actually have some paper dollars somewhere that are on reserve, or something that they consider an equivalent to that. And nowadays, that's largely a large percentage of that is actually held at the Federal Reserve because it reduces the movement of those paper dollars around. And there's another complicating aspect of it, which is the Federal Reserve doesn't always print all of the dollars it's going to issue. It keeps track of them and under what's called Fed obligations. So it might print 30, 40, 50% of the notes. As long as it has enough to keep moving them around, the rest of it can count for in a ledger somewhere. So that the set of dollars that are accounted for are a sum of this yet to be printed number and this actually printed number. But they couldn't do the yet to be printed number unless they could actually eventually go out and print them, right? So this ability to actually print the paper is what makes all of this work. So a bank goes to lend some money. Banks, like anybody else, if they're running a business lending money, they're for interest. What they're doing is they're operating as an investment fund. They take in deposits or they take in loans, which are deposits, right? A deposit's a loan to the bank. They issue further loans and they collect interest on those loans, and they pay that interest to their people they borrowed from, or the people that deposited, people that invested in the bank. It's all the same. The people lent their money to the bank lends it out. you know, makes its own profit on that investment, and has a certain amount of cash drag, because if it's trying to maintain dollar accounts, it has to have enough liquidity to be able to do that. So it's got about a 10% cash drag on that whole process. Okay, so if a bank wants to lend out money and it doesn't have it, what does it do? Well, it can issue the loan and then borrow the money from the Fed, right? The Fed offers money at steep discount to market rates. Market rates of return are about 10%. So Fed will offer 2-3% loans to these banks. The banks lend them out at 10%. So they make the difference. So how can the Fed offer discount loans to these banks? It has to get the money somewhere, right? Well, it gets it through taxation. It taxes people, lends the money out at a discount. That money gets lent out at closer to market rates. Profit from those loans comes back. It gets paid back to the Fed at their rates, and then the Fed remits that to the Treasury as profit, right? So the Treasury issues discount money, and then it collects the profit from lending out that money. So where's the value actually come from? It's come, a taxation against all of the people who hold the money,
right,
has been offered to people who want to borrow the money, and a lot of times it's the same people, right? Homeowners who want discount housing loans, small business owners, student loans, $1 trillion in student debt. Where does that come from? Discount loans, guaranteed loans, which is another form of discount. So it's not as if there's some funny accounting going on here. What's happening is people are being taxed, and that tax money is being offered to other people. That's the nature of the state. That's what they do. So they're just doing it through this really complex mechanism.
The limits of this system, and I guess when my original question, like, people feeling that it maybe can't sustain itself forever, is that the overbearing effect of taxation is the limiting factor?
Tax, right. Now look at Venezuela. Okay, they get a little bit crazy with it. The money devalues so rapidly that now people really see it, right? They're like, oh, what the hell's going on with the money? And first they try to blame it on the speculators, and they shut down the borders and currency controls and whatnot. But eventually people figure it out. And the tax becomes onerous, right? But right now, tax in the West is fairly, it's high, but people are okay with it, so they keep paying it, even if they don't understand what it is. If they came to understand it, or feel the effects of it, even if they didn't understand it, there would be more resistance.
So is that what people should be looking at? More so than inflation, national debt, whatever, just simply tax?
Price inflation in dollars, for example, is the indicator of taxation of dollars, right? That's what they should look at. But people like their benefits. They like their discount student loans. They want to go to school for free. They want to live in cheap housing, right? These are political benefits that are being offered. So they tax everybody kind of opaquely. People who hold the most cash, which, by the way, tends to be less wealthy people, right? People who are much more wealthy hold a much smaller percentage of their assets in money, right? It's just not financially wise to hold, money. I'm not even talking about state money. Any money, because it doesn't return. At best, it holds its value. So, its purchasing power remains fairly constant, but investing your money in production is where you get returns, right? So most people are, that have a significant amount are invested in production, and inflation, it operates as a tax generally, but it doesn't impact future returns, except for this kind of general effect of slowing everybody down, taxing everybody. So you end up taxing people who have less wealth in order to give it to people who are typically middle class, or anybody who's collecting some state benefit. And the political benefit of that is votes, right? You're very popular when you give these things away. So if you can hide the tax and get the votes, yeah, that's great. But the idea that this is somehow the result of banking is just a farce. It's just simply taxation.
Right. And so this dynamic where the state has seigniorage, and as you just described, it seems like it's inevitable that this sort of a system would lead to both inequality, social inequality, but also the ever-growing size and power of the state, because they're the one, because of seigniorage, basically. Well,
inequality is a term I always take I always take issue with, because the objective is wrong. Right? The objective is evil. Right? If you're going to define good and evil as by the moral principle of non-aggression, right? The idea that we're going to make everybody equal would have to be compelled, right? People aren't equal. They're not the same. They don't all want the same things. They don't all have the same abilities. And so the objective is not for people. The objective of free society is not for people to be equal. The objective of free society is for people to be free, to do what they want, and with their own stuff, to trade freely, to act freely. And so that, to me, that's a non-goal, right? Now, it may result in certain groups of people getting taxed more than others. Well, that's the whole point, right? What would be the point of the state if they took the same amount proportionally from everybody and gave it back to the same people, right? There'd be no point. The point of the state is to take from some and give to others.
Right, but in this case, you're saying they're more effective at taxing the people with that are poorer because they have less ability to combat the effects of that taxation.
I'm saying with this form of taxation, which is one of many, right? It stands to reason that people who hold more of their net worth in money pay more of the tax proportionally.
Right.
Kind of like a sales tax, right? Like people who spend all their money that they make every paycheck on purchasing things to survive, whatever, they're paying a higher percentage of their income in purchasing things. But Rothbard has a great chapter on this, the kind of fair tax chapter, where he talks about, like, these things are more complex than people assume. Like an income tax and a sales tax, not really different, right? Because when a company pays the income tax, it just raises the price of their things that they can sell or they don't get sold. And who pays for those? The people that consume them. It's the same outcome in the end. But the idea that the tax can somehow be spread evenly or fairly is contrary to the idea of the state, which is to change the market allocation of these things. It's to forcibly change what would happen in the free market.
Okay, so back to the current example. Should we give a shit about of the level of debt, about how all of that works, about the tax rate? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Well, when credit is offered to people at a discount, people take it, right? Because it's free money. And why wouldn't you take it? You're already paying the tax. Why not get some of it back? So the only debt that I carry is my mortgage. Why? Because if I didn't take it, I would be just giving more tax money away. So people, credit will increase if it's being offered to them if people at a discount. It's being offered from other people, or maybe myself. Right? I'm paying taxes and I'm recouping some of it in holding a discount mortgage, right? And pay a few percentage points in mortgage, which is, and part of it formerly tax deductible, where I can keep the money that I would have paid it off with in investments and make 10%. Okay, so the difference is returned to me. I'll take it. But so you do have an effect on how much debt people carry when debt's being given out more cheaply. But on the other hand, it's being taken from people in tax, so they have less to pay it back with. So you can't even argue that there's more debt because of this. What there is more tax, and you can look at the amount of credit, in the U.S. or in the world compared to the amount of money, and you'll see that it's around 9 times the amount of money. Credit in dollars is about 9 times the amount of debt in dollars. And this is a gross, kind of figure, but it's ballpark enough to see that really that historical 10% reserve that people tend to have, or that rate of lending, is fairly consistent. Okay, so what's actually happening? If there's not necessarily more debt, but you have a state that spends to achieve certain objectives, and in order to spend, it taxes, and some of that spending is discount loans. And the state carries debt. Well, what's the debt? The debt is money that it's borrowed, and so we now get into like treasury bills, right? How the state actually borrows, which is different than just taxing through seigniorage, right? And there's some people that will argue that dollars are debt, which is nonsense. It's just money. It's just discount production because they have a monopoly on the production. Nobody can compete with the production, so they charge a monopoly price for the dollars. It's not debt. It settles. When you accept the dollar, the debt is settled. Right? There's no more debt owed to anybody. So when you're dealing with seigniorage, you're dealing with tax and money, and it's distributed through loans, but it's also distributed in a lot of other ways. And the tax doesn't even have to come from seigniorage. The tax or the discount loans can come from anywhere. So when you're dealing with state debt, state issues debt. People buy the debt because it returns interest. Well, when the state now is going to have to raise taxes to pay back the debt, it becomes costly, especially when they can't raise taxes any higher, but they're still issuing more debt. So Congress goes out, raises the debt ceiling, authorizes the Treasury to go issue more bonds. The Treasury issues the bonds. Now they've got even more debt to pay back. So if you can get the bond rate down, right, the yield on the bonds down, you're going to pay less back in the end. So what happens? The Federal Reserve goes out and buys Treasuries on what they call open market conditions. So the Treasuries get pre-purchased by big banks, right, investment banks and whatnot, and then they know that the Federal Reserve is going to come along and purchase them, and so the banks take their cut on being an intermediary in this process, and the Federal Reserve comes in and buys so many that the Treasury doesn't actually have to pay very much in interest, right? It suppresses the rate by providing a huge amount of demand. So the Treasury, the Federal Reserve will hold these Treasury bills, and eventually the Treasury will pay interest on them at a very small rate. And then again, as I said before, the profit that the Federal Reserve makes goes back to the Treasury, right? So where does the Fed get the money to buy the bonds? It goes to the Treasury and says, print me some money at a discount, right? And it gets taxed. So
it seems kind of like a Ponzi scheme, though, doesn't it?
And it's not a Ponzi scheme. It's very different than that. It's just a way to hide the tax, right? Tax itself is not a Ponzi scheme. As long as the amount that they have to pay back is sustainable, in that people won't revolt at the high inflation or the high taxes, they just keep doing it. And so what happens is we have these very large numbers of outstanding debt to the public, they call it, right, at the Treasury, this huge amount of debt to the public, and somehow that gets paid back. And the Federal Reserve is not the only one that ends up holding these notes, right? They get sold on the market whenever, and people, then Treasury will have to pay back this debt. And if they fail to pay it back, they won't be able to issue new debt, which will be a big problem. So they do pay it back. But so if you look at like a trillion, I don't know how many it is now, $100 trillion in outstanding debt to the public, that is the debt that people should be looking at, right? Because when the state starts defaulting on those notes,
that's future taxation, right?
Well, yeah, but paying off the notes is future taxation.
Yeah.
So it's not as if, as long as it has the ability to tax, it can pay off the notes, right? And a lot of the tax comes through the money, but it comes through a lot of other different means. So it's not quite the same as you and I holding debt, where we have to go earn it to pay it back and just print some. But that's the state's form of earning, right? They tax people. So one argument we make is they just decide to not pay it back, right? This happens all the time. It's, some state goes broke, or maybe, what was it, Cyprus? They just decide to take 10% of everybody's money out of their bank accounts. I think it was like 10% of everything over $100,000. And in Russia, after it was like 91 or so, they just emptied everybody's bank accounts. In Zimbabwe, they prevent people from withdrawing from their bank accounts. Right? There's all these different ways. They just take it when it becomes too onerous to actually print it anymore. They just kind of start taking it. So, or they just raise your tax rates, and it gets to the point where they can't do that anymore. You end up with Greece or something, right? Which is, geez, we're kind of stuck, and we don't print the money ourselves, so we've got to actually tax people, and nobody actually pays their tax. So now we just start getting poor. Okay, people are taxed into being poor. That happens. But it's not as if there's this the financial system has created this house of cards. The financial system is very rational and operates as a market. And what it's doing is it's trying to offset tax in many ways and try to find ways to mitigate it, take advantage of the benefits of it. But it's not creating debt. Right? The state is borrowing against the future to pay to provide things, and so it makes promises like Social Security, huge promise, right? What eventually happens is those promises can't be fulfilled anymore. That's the default on the debt. Does it cause a complete social collapse? Maybe not. Maybe they just stop paying Social Security. Usually what happens, they whittle away at these things. They start taxing Social Security benefits, which happened a while ago, start reducing them, start raising the age of retirement. All these things keep happening, right? Just keep whittling away at the obligation. Start providing, like Medicare service. You just provide crappy service, right? It's a lot cheaper. Try restricting medication. Start, reducing the value of the benefit, and that's what you see the debt getting paid off, right? Getting reduced because the obligation has changed over time. And so, but that's really what you're dealing with is the state not having the ability to keep the promises it's made. And the one promise it does tend to keep is, at least in the U.S., is paying off its debt to the public, like the actual notes, the loans that people that it's issued to the public, that gets paid. All these other things that are benefits, those are not obligations at all. Congress could just wake up one day and say, cancel Social Security. Perfectly legal, right? No obligation to not pass that law, and the debt's gone. Yeah, there's a social impact, right? Let's stop giving out student loans, right? Let's stop guaranteeing all this stuff. Let's stop spending on these programs. Let's shrink the military. They have all those options to them, and that's what happens when countries get heavily in debt. But that's not, when you look at like the market and the amount of debt that people carry, those are market reactions, right? These are people like determining, okay, I can pay this off. There's a benefit to me. I want to build this thing, right? These are rational decisions people are making. The state is just basically hoping some future Congress is going to have to deal with this issue. We don't care about paying this off.
Right.
It's not a concern.
But does it? So if the debt is a representation of future tax that has to be taken, right, or paid by the public, as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger year over year, I mean, is there not a limit to this? Again, back to the original question about, is there not kind of a limit to this system? And a lot of people, especially in the Bitcoin space, thinking, well, Bitcoin is an alternative to the failure of the existing system. I mean, is that not a limiting factor?
Well, the system, I just hate to use that word because it's like it's not the financial system. It's the state, right?
Sure. That's what I'm referring to.
But the debt that matters is the debt carried by the state. Individuals, borrowing from each other is perfectly rational and sustainable.
But they're pretty intertwined, are they not?
No. I mean, yes and no. It's all connected.
The amount of debt that the state holds impacts, the private financial markets and stuff like that. Impacts the taxation rate and the
Yeah, tax affects people and benefits affect, tax and benefits, right? You take away some money from some people and you offer it to other people, and that affects people. Certainly, it's the major effects on people. But, if you stop doing that, market still functions. Right? That's not the problem. The problem is the state doesn't function anymore, and the state doesn't like that, right? So you look at
right. So I guess that's what I'm suggesting, is that the state's ability to operate. Maybe that's a better word for the system. Yeah. So is the current,
these are euphemisms, right?
Right. Is the current way that things are operating going to be in such a way that the state will be able to sustain itself? And that's what I was referring to about the amount of debt and the amount of tax they're going to have to collect.
Maybe. I mean, North Korea is still operating. It's unbelievable, but
well, they're doing so, and I guess this gets into other areas where it says, well, once taxation or the state becomes so onerous, it either directly and consciously or by default enters into more authoritarian, totalitarian measures in order to maintain its power, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I mean. When you look
so
at,
is that the road we're on? I guess is what I'm asking. I mean, that's the road all states are on. Is that the end point of the way that the state, let's just say in the United States, operates? Is that the inevitable end point?
Well, prediction's hard, but you can say that's how all states operate. They can either be conservative with their spending and pay off all their bills, or eventually they can run up a high enough tab that they can't pay it anymore. It's perfectly, once you strip away all the perceived complexities of the system and look at what's really happening, it just comes down to that, right? Can we continue to take in enough tax to pay for the things that we want to pay for? We're going to have to stop paying for them, or as we become more authoritarian to keep ourselves in power, people will just get poorer and we'll maintain our standard of living. And that's those models are played out around the world. All states, to one extent or another, operate in that manner. And it's basically like an individual or business that can forcibly extract money from its customers, right? What incentive do you have to not spend, right? The incentive is the customers will resist at some point, and then you'll have an issue. And sometimes people correct. China made some changes that made them, made the state kind of more able to survive, where the Soviet Union didn't, and they went away. You look at Cuba; it's just continuing along at this low rate with enough balance between oppression and taxation that they can stay in power. But eventually, you have revolutions, and that's just it's called revolution for a reason. It's a cycle, right? We've seen this throughout history. So people try to establish another system that tries to, hedge against that tendency. But I don't think many of the so-called founding fathers of the U.S. ever believed that was really possible. They just tried their best, right? And they said it, right? And probably would be shocked to believe it's lasted as long as it has, because the idea was that a democracy or a representative democracy would be even more willing and able to tax itself to death than somebody who was more rationally trying to stay in power as a king or something, right?
Right.
So it's a natural political progression, and it's hard for people to opt out of it.
Right. And that's one of the reasons why I'm fascinated by the Constitution of the United States, because going back to the gun issue for a moment, I mean, was it not based in kind of the foresight that this system or this type of government would ultimately devolve, and that power would concentrate, and that people would have to have a means of resisting authoritarianism?
Absolutely. I mean, that's very evident in writings of the time. This is your last way to vote, right?
Exactly. But that's very not outside of America. I mean, that's not a very popular.
We have a different history, right?
Yeah.
We have a different history, and it was, United States and America in general, North America, even maybe South America, has this different history where people don't think about this very much, but the United States is the mixing not of just European cultures, but Native American cultures, which have a very different culture and perspective on these things. And I think I listened to somebody talk about this a while ago, like the impacts of the mixing of those cultures over centuries, right, changed, and the kind of pioneer idea, right, where you're just kind of out on your own in the open wilderness, right. This is this kind of romantic vision people have of the founding of America, but it's a different culture. So people at the time, there was a lot of things that kind of came together. I mean, 1776 was when Adam Smith published, The Wealth of Nations, and liberal economic thought and political thought was advancing pretty rapidly, and the American Constitution kind of tries to embody a lot of those ideas, but they're also very English ideas, right? It's memorialized in different ways, but these are largely stolen from, UK.
Yeah. So if we kind of agree or accept that the inevitable conclusion to a political structure like this is authoritarianism, what
I wouldn't say inevitable. I'd say it's just there's a gravity in that direction, right? And then eventually people do something at some point.
Right. Okay. Let's say there's a gravity in that direction. What? And we were just talking about the Constitution. What is your you've said that you used to be a card-carrying member of the Libertarian Party. Now you're an anarchist. What is the distinction in, let's say, in being an anarchist vis-a-vis the structure that we were just talking about? How does it produce, outcomes whereby the individuals in such a structure are more free, more prosperous, or is that even the goal?
Yes and no. So to me, anarchism is it's a personal philosophy, right? I don't. So if you see the state as aggressive, yeah, I mean, I don't know if apolitical is even the right word, but if you see the state as the aggressor, and you're a libertarian because you want to minimize that aggression, but you don't want to eliminate it, right? You have this constant contradiction, and a lot of times that's what happens. People live with that contradiction for a long time, and they either give up on it and become straight up status. I mean, libertarians are statists; they believe in the state, and or you become an anarchist and you go the other way. And when people take very different. I mean, there's very different interpretations of the word anarchism. I use it in the purest sense, which just means no state, right? Non-aggression principle is your single moral principle, and so as with the idea of moral principles, you try to live by them, right? So you don't participate in robbing your neighbors. Okay, you may be compelled to do certain things, but you don't do them willfully, and that to me that's the important distinction. Now, if a lot of people decide they feel that way, the power of the state shrinks pretty dramatically. There's another approach, which is just go tear down the state, and then you're going to figure out what you're going to put up in its place, right? I find that kind of interesting.
What's the implication of having that kind of moral orientation as an anarchist, but having to live in a society that is the whatever you want to call the political structure that we have right now? I mean, because we were talking about earlier about preference versus behavior. If your behavior is going to be forced a certain way regardless, what's the role of having a moral orientation towards being an anarchist?
It's a distinction between being, going out and stealing, committing murder, or not, because you think there's a moral distinction, right? To me, it's the same thing. I wouldn't go and vote for the next mob boss any more than I'd go vote for the next, mayor, because I don't see there's not a distinction philosophically in those cases, in those scenarios. So again, it's to me, it's just a personal philosophy. I don't participate unless I'm compelled to, and maybe sometimes I don't even participate even though it's required. I'm not required to vote, so that's very easy. I haven't voted in maybe 10 years. So yeah, it's very liberating as a personal philosophy to see things clearly and to live your life consistently by that single moral principle. Become a lot less judgmental and a lot less interested in what the state is doing, right? I mean, I sat in a pub today and it was like a continuous newsreel going on, and I honestly don't participate. I don't watch what people call news. I don't read papers. I live in this kind of political bubble, and so my son is always telling me what's going on in the world because he's just a libertarian, so he still cares. Yeah, but
being that's the case, do you? And I'm hesitant to use this word with you because, is there any hope within you that other people adopt that philosophy, and as a result of that, a different structure predominates in a given society, geographical area, or however we want to define, society or boundaries?
Is there hope? Do I have hope that will happen?
Yeah, or would you like to see that happen?
I really don't think about it too much. I like to see people doing what they want to do. I enjoy being
freedom
with people. I enjoy people. I enjoy my own freedom, and I enjoy being with people that are doing what they want to do. And it's one of the things I love about the Bitcoin community. They're very, it's certainly not a consistent anarchist community, but they're very accepting of other people and their own, their lifestyles. And so I like to be around people like that. And to me, that's more important than, trying to figure out some way to tear down some institution and figure out what I'm going to put in its place. I just, people have the choice. People have the choice to exit as much as they want, and if they don't do it, it's not me, but I'm not gonna convince them that they have to. To me, it's almost, it is a religious philosophy because that's my one moral principle. right? Non-aggression. So there's no distinction in that between my political philosophy and my religious philosophy. It's the same.
Non-aggression meaning, not to impose via force, behavior on anybody.
Not to steal from people. It's a very, very simple way to put it. Stealing is, people's bodies are their property, right? The property of their soul, their mind, whatever. And so you have a rational concept of property. Theft is the one crime. And it's an easier way to explain to people what aggression means than saying, well, it's okay if you do self-defense, but whatever, not stealing from people. So yeah, if you're defending yourself, you're not stealing from anybody. You're trying to prevent somebody from stealing from you. So it's just a simpler explanation, but that's what it comes right down to.
Did your time in the military affect your philosophy or point of view on this stuff? Because obviously the military is the apex of the enforcement branch of the state, right? It's the core of their power. Did that influence you in your philosophies?
In some states, in the U.S., the military is much less of a force in people's daily lives than just the police, right?
Well, sure. But if it came down to it, if 100 people rose up or 1,000 people.
Yeah, if I didn't pay my taxes, the Army's not going to show up, right? The sheriff will probably show up eventually and arrest me or something. But
if 100,000 people decided to pick up their guns, then the military would be involved, right? So it's kind of the last stop of the state power. So did your experience in that form your views in any way?
Not really. It gave me an understanding of certain things, but my evolution to a libertarian occurred early in my military time. It wasn't directly. It wasn't. There was a thing, that caused me to start looking. It wasn't really military, and I just evolved from there. And I got out not because of any political reasons. I actually liked what I did. I would have stayed in if I had another life to live. But having only one, I decided I wanted to go out and start a business. That was what I was more interested in doing at the time. So after 10 years, I put in my letter and I got out and I started a software company.
But isn't it the antithesis of the non-aggression principle? The military, the activities they engage in.
Well, remember, I was a libertarian. So libertarians are not anarchists.
Yeah. So the anarchist philosophy came later because you wouldn't be able to claim to be an anarchist and be involved in the military.
Yeah. Well, do you pay your taxes? If you're an anarchist and you pay your taxes, are you living a conflicting life? Well, the difference is
so you have to pay the taxes.
Choice.
You choose. Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. So I had a commitment to the military. So at that point, it still wouldn't have been a choice. But once my commitment was over, I got out. But I didn't get out for political reasons.
Couldn't you just couldn't you break the commitment without any punishment?
Not really. You have a commitment. There's going to be some cost.
Yeah, but it's still your choice, right?
Well, yeah, it's also your choice not to pay taxes. You could just go to jail.
Well,
right? That's the same question. Right?
Will you go to jail if you break your term commitment to the military?
Yeah, you'd be AWOL. Yeah, that's definitely a possibility.
So
you just don't show up for work one day. You just say, I'm not coming.
Well, no, but if you tell them I'm done with this, you can't do that in the military. You can't say
that's called desertion.
So
that's a serious crime.
So if you say you're going to be in the military for 10 years, you absolutely have to be that. You can't say
if you sign
I'd
a
like
commitment
to quit.
for a certain amount of time, you just can't walk, right? Yeah.
They put
that's called desertion. You go to jail for that.
Really?
Yeah. And if you're on the job and you fail to actually do your job, fail to work, right? That's malingering. That's also a crime. And if you take some absence without permission, that's being AWOL, absent without leave. Even if you come back, right? So it's not like you just walk away. But again, this wasn't a decision I was facing. I just decided that I wanted to do other things, and I stayed in because I was fine doing what I was doing. But after a certain amount of time, evolving into the idea that I was not really a libertarian, I was an anarchist, it would be very difficult for me to go back and work in any government role, politician, especially a politician, right? But any kind of direct role would be difficult for me. I would find it just very unrewarding and counterproductive and aggressive.
Yeah.
And so I don't. But evolving from nothing. It took me a while to get to that point.
Sure.
Um,
One of the questions that I wanted to ask when we were talking about taxation and debt and stuff that I missed. One of the social trends seemingly emerging in the United States and other areas of the world today is maybe maybe I'm incorrect here, but in your mind, is there a re-emergence of the popularity of socialism, and if so, do you have an opinion on that?
I don't know. I really don't. I mean, to me, it's all.
I guess if you're not paying attention to the news, you wouldn't be as acutely, you wouldn't be as aware as people who are paying attention.
Yeah, everybody's always trying to pin this on the kids, right? They're, I've got two kids, 17 and 19, and they're not that way at all, but they've grown up with rational answers to questions, and so they've developed their own philosophy that's a lot more, understanding of the world. But there's a lot of that around. But to me, the term socialism is kind of, to me, it's all just statism, right? The state has this power. We bless the power. We want you to take some money from these people and give it to these people.
Different manifestations of that power.
Whatever label you want to put on that, right? Yeah, I mean, it could just be nationalism and militarism. It's all the same to me. It's, socialism, social welfare state, communist state.
Are there any? We have examples of quote unquote these different systems, right? Are there any examples throughout history of? And I guess you wouldn't be able to isolate it as a, as a state, obviously, but any examples of en masse anarchy in any places in the world, in the way that you're, adhering?
No, I can think of. I mean, that's why it's not like. I mean, there's been times when people have said that. There was the anarchists in Spain in the Spanish Civil War. There was the anarchists, the communists, and the royalists, I guess, right? And the anarchists and the communists thought they were fighting together until the communists, started fighting the anarchists. And
right.
Orwell went and fought for the socialist side, which was the two fighting alongside each other until he had to flee because he was on the wrong side. So if you ever get a chance to read Ode to Catalonia, which was the book that he wrote about his experience in Spain, it's very interesting. That's what made him, kind of a cynic about a lot of things, even though he remained a socialist for the rest of his life. So
do you think that's at all, do you think there's anything in human nature in which we desire the comfort or certainty of structure, and as a result maybe the philosophy of anarchy is difficult for people to, even though they may fight for it in one sense, but then once they maybe get the power or win the battle or whatever it is, they're like, oh, we've got to structurize, we've got to solidify our ethos, our way of interacting, and then that becomes the same thing all over again?
Yeah, I saw this in talking to Amir about Syria and Rojava. Hey, can you hold on a second? I need to get a drink of water. I'm going to pass out.
Yeah, I'm going to do the same.
Okay.
Okay.
Take 5. timing. You can just edit that out. Huh?
Yeah, no problem.
How do you do your? Maybe you've been doing this for a while. How do you do your broadcast?
In terms of,
how do you create the podcast and put it out? From Skype.
So I use Ecamm call recorder. So you purchase it. I think it's about $40, and it just a little window pops up when you create the call. You press record. It shows you your input output levels. Little blinking red light to make sure it's going. And then as soon as you hang up, it creates audio and video files afterwards. So
cool.
Yeah, it's pretty simple. I mean, what I'm finding actually doing this is a lot of people have given up on Skype, it seems. I mean, I was one of them too. I haven't used Skype in years until I started doing this podcast. I just thought it would be the easiest method. There's a couple other solutions. Zencaster I know is used by some other podcasters. So
Zoom.
Yeah, so I'll use that if absolutely necessary. But this setup seems to work all right.
I've got just about every app that you could have a video conference on my phone now.
Because you do so many.
Just pick one, it's okay. I do tend to do a lot of these on my phone because I travel so much. But I was able to sit here at my desk for once.
Yeah. Eric, by the way, I mean, you tell me when you want to shut it down, because I'll probably just keep going.
We'll go a little bit, maybe say 9 o'clock my time, another 35 minutes or so.
Okay, perfect.
That'd be probably a good stop.
All right, so where were we? What were we talking about?
Talking about anarchism and
right. So
what it means.
One of the, I guess, questions I had, because the reason why we listen to these conversations, the reason why we have these conversations, at least one of them, or I'll just say from me, is I'm constantly trying to determine the best way to orient my life, myself in this world, and achieve the things, objectives, relationships that I want. And so from an anarchist perspective, is the kind of operating life philosophy just to engage in work and projects that promote freedom and only comply with the state when you're compelled to do so?
Well, I mean, the ideal is everybody doing what they want to do, and if they want to work on, if they want to make cheese, I mean, that's
right,
great.
Sure, right.
It's not like always working on everything that's going to
promote freedom. Sure.
Promote freedom. That is freedom, right? And so living the freest life you can, living the life you want to live, is I think the primary objective. And I don't go around and encourage people to stop what they're doing and go, take up their keyboard and start writing some, cypherpunk code or something. It's
right.
It's just what I like to do. It's so as far as life philosophy, like I said, to me, I just came to the conclusion over time this is just a personal philosophy, and it does motivate me to make tools and do things that will help other people live more independently, live more the way they want. And you find, I think, over time that philosophy is very non-judgmental, and that's, I think, it makes you open to a lot more things. It makes people more attractive, in general, and just doing what they do. And I've always been very appreciative of just people who make things, who do things, who achieve things, doing what they like, and so there's this principle of non-aggression is just the kind of, I think, universally understood concept, that you don't steal from people, right? I mean, there's not many cultures in the world that don't understand, even if they do it, that's there's a moral issue there.
Yeah.
And so it's really, if that's the one thing that everybody kind of inherently agrees on, it makes it very easy to get along with people and relate to people around the world, with all different types of backgrounds, cultures, whatever. It's just very easily understood, and so you live your life that way, and you find the world's a pretty easy place. You know, there's difficult, dangerous situations you can get into, but I think a lot of people get into trouble just because they're either uncomfortable around people that are different, even though they're peaceful, or they're judgmental because they don't have, you know, moral clarity themselves. And that's very liberating when you get past that, and it just makes it unnerving to sit there and watch and read and listen to these things that are all about aggression. Like I started to say before, I was sitting in this small pub down the road today, actually right before we got on this call, and you know, it was just this newsreel. Just, it's the standard stuff. It's like local Seattle news, just going around and around, and just nonstop, right? Just shit. And I had to walk out and sit on the sidewalk for a while. I stopped listening to it. It's like, man, this is what people listen to all day long. It's what they care about. You know, it's what's on the big screen. It's either some, you know, sports event, or it's politics. You know. Yeah, and so I just like to surround myself with people who are just making things, doing things, providing services to other people, and you know, and some small subset of us, you know, are people that make tools to make that easier.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are look out on the world, and whether it's what, you know, the constant download from the news media, or their perceived level of oppression from the structures in society and that sort of thing, and it greatly influences their experience of happiness and peace. And
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and what I'm hearing from you is that, you know, the philosophy that you've developed has, not that you are not aware of that, I'm sure you are, and that's, as you just said, you're kind of hypersensitive to it from being down in the pub and being exposed to it for a very short period of time relative to everybody else.
It's like kryptonite.
Right. But, you know, I get a sense of kind of, call it peace, call it Zen, call it whatever you want from you, and I think there's, I mean, whatever people's perception are of the things that are impinging on their happiness, I'm sure there's some level of truth and maybe some level of self-imposed delusion or a perception that may not be grounded in quote-unquote reality, though that sometimes they're difficult to separate. Do you, I mean, for the perceived ills in society, for the ones that you perceive, is it just a matter of focusing on the things from which you derive happiness and peace, and that's your way of mitigating its negative impact on your mood or your level of happiness?
Maybe. I don't know. I think it's part of it. I don't just avoid things because they make me unhappy or whatever. You know, I just like not just seek out things that feel good. That's not. I mean, at work it doesn't always feel good, even though I kind of, it's mostly volunteer work. I
don't mean it in a hedonistic sense. I kind of mean like focusing on the positive, you know.
But I'm not even. Yeah, I can't. I mean, I actually don't have, you know, a lot of questions you have. I had very clear, thought out answers from many discussions in the past, and this is something I'm gonna have to think about for a bit. But what do I do? I do seek out. Well, I tend to just spend time with people that I enjoy and people that, you know, that have a very different perspective on the world. I find it difficult to relate to them, and I just don't spend a lot of time with people that I can't connect to in some way. It doesn't have to be anarchists, right? But just people that are doing things that are like, I'm not you know, what we consider a religious person, but I have, you know, a couple of friends that are very religious-y. And I don't have any problem with it. You know, those things that are different are not problematic for me. It's when people are their focus is aggression, right? It's about what everybody else needs to do, and a lot of this is kind of misguided perceptions on reality. It's kind of what you were talking about, right? They maybe they don't understand what they're doing, but a lot of times the people who feel like they're the liberators are just the aggressors, and that's they're very common. Right, you know, well, there's this oppression. You know, people said something to me; they were oppressing me. I'm like, no, they're just talking. Go somewhere else, right?
Yeah.
So
Well, that's a huge issue in society today, and if you're not, if you don't
Yeah,
keep
no,
up on the news, then maybe you're not as familiar with it as many
yeah,
of
I'm
us.
not a
But
social justice warrior at all, right?
right, right,
You know, but I'm entirely accepting of people of all walks and preferences and whatnot. You know, that's no issue for me at all. I'm not very accepting of people who want to you know, oppress other people who actually believe that they're the ones being oppressed, right? It's just like this inversion that because people don't understand aggression, they don't understand what they're actually talking about. So that, you know, that tends to be, yeah, I find that very off-putting, and I tend to avoid that. But then you find some people who you might imagine are in that camp, and they're very different. So I don't know. I just this is one of these things where, like, I don't know, I haven't had to answer this type of question. Like, what do I actually do? I just enjoy, like, I travel a lot, right? I've been to 80 countries, and most of that's been the last 10 years after I got out of the Navy. I mean, I've been out for 20 years. Most people say, well, I travel all over the world because I was in the Navy. Maybe 10 countries or something. But no, it's become more of a passion in the last, you know, 10 years, even 5 years, where I just travel aggressively because I like to experience different people, and, you know, you just find the similarities of people all around the world, and you find that even though they're maybe living in under some oppressive regime, their daily life is actually very different. They just ignore it, and they go about their daily life. They avoid it as much as they can, and it's almost like they're living the same way that I imagine, right? Like, yeah, there's this, you know, communist state or whatever. We're just out here working our asses off and making what we can and trying to ignore them. And, you know, a lot of times the people they're trying to ignore are actually trying to ignore it too. They're just all in this system, as you say, right, where they do the best they can. I mean, so I find that really interesting. I just enjoy people living their lives and doing what they want to do, and you just find that there's just a lot of I think being open to, you know, if you really do truly hold that one principle, it makes you very non-judgmental, and that makes it possible to relate to a lot more people.
Yeah,
and you worry about a lot fewer things, right?
Right. Well, that's the peace,
you know,
part, you know.
Yeah, yeah. You just worry about fewer things, and you relate to more people, and it's more enjoyable. And so, again, to me, it's a personal philosophy. I don't. I had somebody say to me, it was somebody's wife, and one not a native English speaker. So she said something to him, and he said, I said, what did she say? He says, she said, you don't look. She said, you don't look like an anarchist. Like, what's an anarchist supposed to look like, right?
Well, there is that image of, you know, this, you know, lawless. Yeah, anarchy has a bad branding, that maybe we should call it, you know. Well,
and it's because it's associated with things that aren't actually anarchy. You know, I mentioned the Spanish Civil War. They weren't anarchists. They were just the term I use is anarcho-communists.
Right.
You take Rothbard's anarcho-capitalist, which is just an attempt to recover the term anarchist in a way that doesn't imply you're a communist or, you know, something. So there's a very fine line between the anarchists, in the war in Spain, and the communists. They were partnered together. So, you know, anarchist bombings, anarchist wars, people have this association with this violent, group of people that want to overthrow everything and don't know what they're going to put in its place. And so there's always that perception, but I'm just very straightforward about it. No, I mean, what does that mean? This means I just, I don't contribute to the state. I don't see it as good. And people can usually identify with that. A lot of people I talk to identify with that, but would never even consider calling themselves anarchists because of the baggage that's associated with it. So I just decided I didn't care what people thought about what I said. I just if you want to know, and I'm not going to, I'm vast majority of the time, I don't even go like anarcho-capitalist, because then that has other implications that people misinterpret. I just I'm just not a statist.
And just, very brief background for kind of my perspective is when I was late teenage years, read a lot, consumed a lot, looked out at the world a lot, and thought, a lot of beauty in it for sure. and I've always, my disposition has always been to be, you know, happy and optimistic. But I was like, oh God, you know, there certainly looks like a lot of headwinds and a lot of things that at least I'm perceiving as being undesirable in society. And then that was a bit of a dark period. And you know, you're either forced to accept that or forced to change your perspective, adopt a different philosophy. And I would say the one that I adopted was somewhat similar. I never called myself an anarchist, but similar to you, you know, your perspective on judgment, perspective on engaging people with you know, whose company you enjoy, who stimulate you intellectually, who, you know, focusing on the things that are in your control that you can derive meaning and happiness and fulfillment out of. And that goes a long way to mitigating the negative effects of your perceived societal ills, let's say. And you know, what excites me is that is just a change of mind. And so when people talk about, when people talk about how Bitcoin influences people's perception and you know, their philosophy and how they look out at the world, and yes, people get carried away and all that kind of stuff, but I'm just excited for anything that has the capacity to, you know, change someone's mind, change someone's perspective, because that's, you know, that's the most powerful thing there is. We were talking about, you know, aggression and state power and stuff like that. I mean, it only exists because people have that perspective. If everybody felt the way that you just articulated, well, there'd be nobody to enforce the power of the state. You know, so all of this is just a matter of, you know, our perspective and how we choose to act. And I don't know why I'm excited about that, but I think it's probably because that's such a changeable thing. Yeah, it's liberating.
You can change yourself, and
yeah,
you don't have to wait for everybody else to change along with you, and you can be happy and still, you know, contributing to something larger by being that way. And as you said, you know, if a lot of people do that, then things do change. And when I talk about, like, I've talked to kind of more revolutionary anarchists, more traditional anarchists about change, and, you know, they tend to be impatient and want to, you know, I'm not talking about violent action or anything, but just kind of aggressively go out there and force some change in the world. And my perspective is that change, meaningful change, is economic in nature. Economic just means the behavior of people, really, choices that people make. And so maybe, you know, and tools tend to facilitate those changes, right? Like, so you take the Industrial Revolution. Well, it was a revolution of ideas that were pretty. I mean, the term radical is actually the term put on those ideas, right? That when you use the word radical politically, it means radical free market person. I mean, you know, it means extreme free market person. It's a radical idea, and, you know, this idea took hold in the UK more than anywhere else, which became the center of the Industrial Revolution. And it was really, you know, there's always, I mean, another great Rothbard observation. You know, the world's full of great ideas. There's just no capital to produce enough, you know, all of them. So, you know, it's like the cheapest thing in the world is great ideas, but people have to accumulate enough wealth to be able to lend it to produce the next thing, and so on. And so as people get wealthier, you know, we get better tools, and as we get better tools, we get wealthier. Yeah. That's an economic change. It's not somebody coming up with a great idea. It's the economic change that leads to new things getting produced. You know, steam engines and, you know, railroads and things that people look back and go, oh, you know, what an awful time, the Industrial Revolution in England. And you look, well, what did they have before that, right? Why were they all flooding into the city to work at these jobs? Because life on a farm was hell, right? It's something to idealize it, but, you know, I come from a family of farmers. You know, life on the farm is hard, and not a lot of people wanted to stay when they had the option to get out. So, you know, this evolution of, you know, increasing wealth leads to increasing exchange of ideas, travel, information, you know, trade between people brings people together. It binds them in different ways, makes them less likely to go to war with each other. And to me, that's the long arc of history, right? Wealth increases despite, you know, significant destruction of wealth by the state. And So when somebody says, "Oh, are you hopeful about the future? Everything's going to shit," I'm like, "No, it's not really how it goes." I just keep chipping away at my little piece, and the world will get better over time.
Yeah, I think a lot of people, and this may get exaggerated, it may get overblown, overly enthusiastic, and there's certainly this applies to Bitcoin. But I think people may probably recognize that technology and innovation that allows for the expression of different forms of behavior and the types of behavior that people would deem more desirable, at least from an individual perspective for themselves, is kind of, I think they see that as a kind of salvation. Because as you just said, the different technologies that enable the expression of different behaviors, if they're behaviors that that are in line with our philosophy and that we freely choose to engage in, then it's not a very big stretch to say that the technology as an enabler of that behavior leads to the salvation that behavior allows for. You know what I mean?
Tools empower everybody, good and
right.
evil. And
but that seems to be a trend too. I mean, I know that all tools can be used for evil, but
there's more good people in the world than there are evil people. That's the way I look at it, right? The vast majority. Vast majority of people are not, are not at least knowingly aggressive, whether they're statists or not, right? That's more a question of understanding than anything. So yeah, I mean, I guess that's probably I'm being a little contradictory, because you could say that most people want the state and they want this, right, but they don't see themselves as stealing from other people. They don't think of it that way because they've been conditioned, culturally, socially, politically to think that way. But
anybody who hasn't been unplugged is an agent, to borrow a metaphor from the Matrix.
Right, but if you give somebody the option to donate their own money to putting up a school, versus going to their neighbor's house with a shotgun and saying, "Give me your stuff, I'm going to put up a school." Most people would rather give their own money, right? Right. And so they just don't see it that way. So that's what I mean when I say people, most people would adhere to that principle if they actually saw it as that. And you see, it's such a there's this great show my son loves called Practical Jokers. You ever heard of this? It's been on for years. I never saw it till this year. And it's really interesting in a certain way. This is three guys that are like high school friends. They're like all gray and bald now. They've been doing it for so long, but they start out and they're really young, and they just go and break social convention. They just go record each other. They're like a couple of kids that are just stupid, but they're in New York, and they just go to a park, and they challenge each other to do things that are extremely embarrassing, and eat off of somebody's plate. Sit down at their table. Whatever. It's just, and so these guys are professionals. It's what they do. It's what their show's all about. And it's so hard for them to do sometimes. They just don't do it. Like, they take the penalty, and then that's even worse, but they're still not going to do it, right?
Right.
And it just shows you how strong social convention is, right? Like, stealing somebody's food off their plate is, really hard to do. But even something, I like that they did one episode on line cutting. Broadway show, big line, around the block, and they're just trying to figure out, who can cut the furthest in the line and get up to the front and get the tickets, right? And it was funny to me because I always use this as an example of property, right? I just cooked it up one day. I was in Moscow, and I was at a Starbucks, and I'm sitting there with my son, and I'm like explaining to him for, I don't know, the umpteenth time, property. And I said, "Look, we're here in this place. It's owned by Starbucks. It's leased by, from the building owner, whatever. And there's a line up there to get coffee. And that's property being created because people are taking possession of something and holding it. And every person in that line knows that it's property. And if you go and cut in that line, you're stealing from everybody in behind you." Right, and they may not enforce it, and it may not be worth it to them, but a lot of times they will. But if you were in line and you sold your position to somebody else, that's fine, right? Sell your property. Most people wouldn't care if you stepped out and somebody took your place, right? If you ask somebody to donate their property, to let you cut in line, a lot of times they will, right? But it follows all these rules of property, and it's simply created out of nothing, which is kind of what property is, right? It takes some existing capital, like your body, to take possession of something and now it's property. So this idea of, everybody understands like theft and aggression, right? And this is an aggression. You're stealing somebody's property, right? They've held this position, and now you're taking it from them. And so it's just such a great example of the understanding that exists around the world in terms of aggression, theft, property, how they're formed, even if people don't consciously think about it, because most of the times they don't. They all understand it.
Well, you make
and of course, you go to places where they like line cutting and mob lining is like they don't know how to queue, right? It's a different social structure, but there's still a process. There's still a structure that exists. I mean, you saw people standing in line to return their 100 rupee notes, and like 6 people died doing that, right? I mean, these lines were epic, right?
Yeah.
Photos of them miles long. And it's interesting because India is a culture where you kind of get the feeling like there's no lines, right? Everybody just jams up to the front, at every kind of time the traffic stops and everything. But it's actually very well ordered, all around the world. So yeah, it's all I'm saying is that there's this universal principle that's extremely hard for most people to break, right? And that just shows you that, like, these guys that do it for a living, like, it's just like so hard for them to do something that is considered, it just shows you the effect of somebody's conscience, on what they do is pretty strong with most people, right?
Right. What you just said also maybe was a good example at illustrating something. And the line example where if you just jumped in front of somebody, then they would take issue with it. They yell at you, maybe they hit you, maybe they push you away. But if you go up to them and you say, I'll give you $1, or I'll give you this cheeseburger, or I'll give you my line in next week's whatever, like, exactly. And so in this case, this is an illustration of trade mitigating aggression. And I think this is a pretty universal benefit of trade and free markets. And that's why I think many of us are probably proponents of them, because we recognize that the ability to trade is one of the ways that we resist or mitigate aggression.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, that's probably a pretty fundamental, because otherwise it's kind of it's a power dynamics at play. But the fact that, and this is kind of, I think, another reason why people get excited around Bitcoin and around, maybe Lightning Network and the ability to trade in smaller and smaller denominations and things of that by using a different form of money, is that because the more we can categorize things and use, like the person standing in the line has basically created property around them out of nothing, the more that we can do that, put a price on it, and make it available for trade.
Sorry, you're frozen.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah, you're back now.
Yeah.
You were frozen.
I was just saying, the more we can, categorize an entity of any kind, put a price on it, and enter it into the market for trade, seemingly that is a huge facilitator of peace, of non-aggression, of cooperation.
Yeah.
And I think that's why people get excited about these technologies.
There's so much misinformation or misunderstanding of these simple economic ideas that lead people to internal conflict, unnecessary conflict. Like, for example, you want to sell something, you name your price. Well, some people will get this, like, because of the cultural baggage they're carrying, lack of, kind of really thinking it through. They don't want to charge too much because it's greedy, right? I had this conversation with somebody the other day. I'm like, you charge whatever you want, right? Like, they don't have to pay you, right? It's your stuff. And if you're feeling bad because you're not getting what's worth, what you feel worth, but you don't want to charge anymore, then that's your problem, right? That's you have this hang up over this kind of indescribable word people call greed, which is just like, look, these are voluntary trades. And I've encountered like 2 people over the last couple of weeks I had this discussion with, was like, you charge whatever you want, and if you're willing to walk away below that, if you're happy above that, then okay, that's your whatever you're going to charge for this thing. And And why do you feel bad about it, right? You feel like you're a slave to this other person. You got to give them, something that you don't want to give them, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, it's so greedy. It's so much. It didn't cost me that much to make it, or whatever. Like that's irrelevant, right? It's a classic business error.
There seems to be pushback in the culture today. You hear people say like, everything has a price, as if that's a negative. But if we extend, what I just said, in that trade actually mitigates aggression and facilitates cooperation and the improvement of the lives of the actors involved in the trade, then everything having a price facilitates more trade, and that's actually a good thing, and the culture seems to, or not the culture, I commonly hear, as you just mentioned, you commonly or recently heard a couple, had certain conversations in that vein. I've certainly had conversations where people are disappointed that everything in our culture today, quote unquote, everything in our culture today, has a price on it, and they see that as a negative. And in the context of this discussion now, and it's not something that I've really given much thought to, but it seems like it's actually the reverse. It's actually a positive thing.
Yeah. I mean, okay. So we talk about a money price, right? As if that's different than a barter price. Somehow a barter would be better, right? Just now you just have more problems, more complexity, more difficulty, but it's better because it's not a money price. That's just a kind of an odd perception, right? Like, I'd be willing to trade you this horse for this cow, but if I put a price on this cow and it's as much as the price on your horse, then there's something wrong with that, right? I'm charging this, and I should be just trading it. But then there's this, along those lines you get this idea of equality, right? Somebody's got more stuff than me, right? Yeah. Well, did he steal it from somebody? Maybe he did, but if he traded for it and somebody gave him what they thought it was worth, then how is there any wrong being done here, right? Yeah. I mean, the wealth objectively isn't, again, not stolen, is an indication that you've satisfied a lot of people, or at least satisfied people to some extent that may be greater than some other person, right? I mean, there's also how much you spend contributes to your wealth, but again, your ability to earn is a reflection of how much you're satisfying other people, how much if you're doing it voluntarily, how much you're giving them what they want, and in a free market where there's no monopoly protection, right? People make whatever they want, and if you charge a price that's too high, somebody comes in and makes it cheaper. You lower your price, you stop selling it, right? And people have all these hang-ups about wealth, like somehow we all need to be equal. Well, why, right? I mean, that's just not even rational to me. Equal in what, right? So,
and so it's a boon to free markets, is it not, to have a money that is more divisible and cheaper to transact because it brings more potential exchanges onto the market. Does that square?
It may not be. It may not cause more. I mean, okay, like Bitcoin has a fee to transact. It's inherent in the money, and it goes up the more people around the world who are using the money at any given time. That's very unique, right? Nothing has that feature, right? And so we talk about a money that's expensive to use. Bitcoin can be expensive to use, and then you've got taxes, which are, but that cost is really offsetting other tax, right? So when it becomes too expensive to use, and it's actually the tax is cheaper, you just use the other money, right? So monies do have cost to use. There's a say cost for gold. There's
but generally the lower the transaction fee, the more things we'd be able to enter into the market, right? Because some things will be below the threshold of the transaction fee, and therefore I can't enter into the market. You get this
utility threshold where the money's not usable below some certain level. And it's interesting that people talk about, in Bitcoin, people talk about Lightning kind of eliminating that, and that's just not the case. All that happened, with respect to Bitcoin, as you batch up more transactions, the utility threshold will actually rise, right? You'll be less able to use Bitcoin. And people imagine everything just happening in Lightning, but if you don't have the ability to settle, right, it always comes back to settlement. People ignore this, then there's no security, right? So you've basically decoupled the credit, which is, it's a one-to-one credit. It's still credit on the money from the money, which is exactly what happened with the Federal Reserve note and the gold, right? They were bound. They had to settle in gold, and then they were decoupled, You're no longer able to settle in gold. So now the dollar is the paper is actually the money. That's what settles the debt, not the gold. And in Lightning, if you're just doing Lightning transactions, it's too expensive to open and close a channel. Say it gets to 10%, Bitcoin 10% in fees of whatever the kind of current average transaction value is, and so people are able to open a channel at a 10% of whatever they've opened it at, and then they close it at 10%. That's 20%. That's 2 years worth of investment gains wiped out just by opening and closing, right? So that becomes infeasible, and people say, well, we just want to open and close, and well, then you've wiped out your security, guarantees. You're basically floating now, and so this is, it's getting more into the crypto economic side of things, but by ignoring those consequences, people come to invalid conclusions.
So does Lightning, in your mind, fulfill any function? Any desirable function?
It does. I mean, it's a money certificate, technically, on Bitcoin as money, and it can allow people to do the behavior is pretty straightforward. You're batching up multiple transactions and settling them in one transaction, but you need to be able to settle at any given time, or you lose your security. So it has limits, but the money itself is still affected by that, right? So as the transactions that are hitting the chain get larger and larger, because it's happening because the fees are getting higher and higher, so people are using the other money and then they're batching them up and settling them on chain. What's happening is, like you said, you're wiping out all the possible utility in the money below that level. Right? In Bitcoin, there's no transaction that can occur below that threshold. Well, there's a lot more smaller transactions than there are bigger transactions. So you imagine some proportionality between the small ones and the big ones. You take out 50%. Say the largest transaction you could secure on Bitcoin was $1 billion worth, and then smallest was whatever one Satoshi was, right? And there's this range. Well, if you divide that in half and you take like $500 million and you said, well, anything below that's not possible, right? We've just wiped out, if it's proportional, you've wiped out half the value. So in other words, as you move this threshold up, you're wiping out as much value as you're increasing in terms of size. Right. So you reach the conclusion that once you hit a fee level that is no longer tenable, you've reached the highest carrying capacity of the money. And Lightning can't change that. It can allow people to transact more, but they still have to have the ability to settle, and that's driven by the price of settlement on the chain. So
in your opinion, the Lightning Network's not going to kind of usher in a boom in microtransaction capability, at least not below.
If you're doing microtransactions that are worth pennies, right, but you're having to settle in dollars every time you open a channel, you're taking a huge risk, right? So it really is not. It's not as much of a mitigator as people think. And I tend to look at, you can't really separate the money from the credit. People imagine Lightning kind of separating from Bitcoin somehow, and that's not possible. So I just tend to focus the analysis on Bitcoin and see what happens as this threshold moves up, whether it's happening from Lightning or anything else. And you come to the conclusion that unlike any other money or thing in the universe, right, Bitcoin has this unique property because it gets more expensive to use the more people are using it. And so that's what determines its dust level, right? Like dust in gold is not atoms, it's dust, right? And dust in Bitcoin is not Satoshis, or the divisibility is not atoms, and the divisibility is not Satoshi. Right. The divisibility is the minimum transactable amount, and so the divisibility of gold kind of remains constant because as it increases in purchasing power, more gets created at the same rate, pretty much, that it's increasing in purchasing power, right? So it maintains a fairly constant purchasing power, and it maintains a level of dust that stays pretty constant. But the assay cost of gold is fairly fixed. It doesn't matter how much you have, the cost of assaying it is fairly constant. It's not a function of how many other people are trading it, right, at the same time. So Bitcoin has this unique aspect. It's not driven by its supply cap. It's driven by its transaction cap, right? Which
Yeah.
is the more people are doing it, the more expensive it gets to do. And so you end up, based on how much people are willing to pay to transact, a limit to the amount of economic activity that can be carried out
Yeah.
in
Yeah,
Bitcoin. But that doesn't mean it can't function. That just means that the solution is different than people imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And given that the way that Bitcoin's fee structure was designed, do you think Bitcoin will ever be able to fulfill this kind of microtransaction scenario that we've been articulating, or do you think it just because of that it won't really be possible to onboard all those smaller market and exchange activities that are below the threshold of the fees?
Well, BTC is already unable to do that, right? So I looked at this, so I kind of derived a series of conclusions over time and kind of came to this one, and then looked at like, well, what's going to happen if it's, and this has already happened. People just don't really want to recognize it as it becomes too expensive to transact because there's more transacting going on in this money. People just use a different money. Now that could be the dollar. Yeah, we use dollars instead sometimes because it's too expensive in terms of time, fees, whatever. And right now fees are really low, and we're not anywhere close to that kind of limit. But we have wiped out certain sizes of transactions. So, to me, the most rational approach is that once you get to a point where it's no longer tenable, then people just start using another chain, right?
So it
could be almost identical, right?
Yeah. So in that case, Bitcoin, rather than being a replacement for the U.S. dollar, is more akin to a replacement for the $20 bill, and we may have something in the future that is or
the $100 bill, or the $10,000
bill, or the $1 bill, or the 1 penny bill.
Yeah.
Each those denominations will become monetized on different chains.
Yeah.
Or different monetary media or whatever.
The conclusion I come to is that once you reach a certain level of transactability on one, you reach a limit. Like any more money any more economic activity that's added, increasing in size of the transaction, wipes out as much as it's adding. So that the price can't go any higher, right? You can't. No more demand can be satisfied without the proportional amount of elimination of demand. So then Gresham's law kicks in, and you say, well, use a cheaper money, and a money that's better for my circumstance. And so I can imagine, and this is just kind of a theoretical model, but what I see happen, and this only happens when there's enough activity on one chain for it to become viable on another. But you could have another almost identical coin with just a different genesis block and a 1-bit change to the mining algorithm, right? And now you've got another chain that needs a good amount of investment in terms of hash rate to get it started, but at some point it'll be worth it, and then people do that. And then what you see is as it grows in security, you can secure more money on it against double spends. You would see stuff that maybe was on the other chain being transacted off in order to, because it doesn't require that level of security. So you see this arbitrage between a couple of chains, and then you could see it happening again on the second one, right? And they kind of reach some equilibrium, and then another one comes along, and another one comes along, and it can go on perpetually.
Right. The $20 bill becomes the $100 bill, becomes a $1,000 bill, and then new ones emerge to fulfill the lower transaction.
Right. So you can see this kind of set of chains that 1, 2, 3, 4, whatever, that just kind of grow until there's no more expansion, there's no more demand for new money. But there's always, as long as there's economic growth, and we're assuming, like, say, just assume a theoretical universal Bitcoin money, then there'll be growth in demand, right? And so in gold, what you do is you mine more, and but in Bitcoin, creation of new units is not what solves this problem. It's creation of new chains, so you can have so you can transact more, right? The transaction cap is the issue, not the number of units. The number of units is completely irrelevant. If you're mining it at current cost, it's not inflationary, not price inflationary. So
and I like to kind of, when I fantasize about this stuff and let my mind go away from its tether to reality, or too tight a tether, I imagine a future where almost every activity is priced or monetized. Like maybe every step you take in the future is counted by your sneakers and has a price on it because the company that you work for values the fact that you still exist in the world and you're not dead yet, or something. I know that's kind of maybe dystopian, but something like that, you know, where so many of the behaviors, either by our devices and our tools or by us ourselves, maybe we get to a point where breathing is monetized because we're taking, you know, air or oxygen from other people that might be able to use it more effectively, just like really far out stuff like that. But
people do price everything. They just don't price it in monetary terms, right? They make decisions, this over that.
Right.
That's
but I mean pricing it. It's a mechanism that will allow us to price it in a monetary term so that it can be exchanged and enter the market, you know. And I guess in the context of what we're discussing, we're going to need something that, you know, well, has the ability to do that. And, you know, the cost of transacting is going to be a major variable in that.
But this approach, right, solves. I actually haven't even written this up yet, but I've been meaning to write up a topic like this. And usually these things aren't very clear in my mind until I wrote them up. Like sometimes I'll find an error and I'll like, wasn't it good? Because writing it up kind of formalizes it in my mind. But I thought through this a lot, and I think that this idea of you know, kind of multiple chains that are carrying different levels of transaction value solves one of the problems that people have been unable to solve in Bitcoin, which is sharding, right? Like you don't want to, like, I don't like this idea of pruning the chain on your node, right? I think disk space is the cheapest resource on a computer, and you know, Bitcoin just really does not need it. But it basically prevents other nodes from bootstrapping and starts to cause people to use trusted models. So not a big fan of pruning, but sharding, people have tried to figure out on, you know, in Bitcoin, like how do we spread this around, is naturally occurring in that type of model, right? Where, you know, if you only care about the smaller transactions, then you just run that chain, right? You don't need the other ones. And you know, in some cases you might care about a bunch and you're required to carry more data, but it offloads that cost to the places where it's needed, not required for everybody. So it has that benefit as well. And with things like atomic swaps, you know, people can actually convert between the chains. They can pay the higher fee to get the higher level of security, pay the lower fee, you get lower level of security. And these are trade-offs that people consciously make, and you have kind of this natural arbitrage. And I have this, you know, theory that this can all be papered over with some good UI and, you know, some technical work where you don't even notice it, right? Your wallet takes care of it, and so I honestly think that's the only solution to that problem that I can imagine, and given the same implementation, right? Like we're just talking about Bitcoin the way it is today. Like the way it is today, if it doesn't get enough use, it'll just kind of continue the way it is. But if it gets extraordinary use, then something will happen, and I think that's it. Kind of already happens, right? People just don't really recognize it that way. And so anyway, I'm not, you know, not unhopeful about, you know, a future. I just don't think people see it as, you know, entirely rationally a lot of times.
Yeah, honestly, I hadn't been looking at it that way until this discussion today, but it's definitely going to provide me with some intellectual chewing, you know, over the next little while to think about how that might ultimately play out, because it does seem like you know, that there's a possibility or probability of that being the case. Yeah. Well, speculators don't like it because it implies that, you know, it's inflationary, right? Like, okay, there's new units being created in this one money, so my money's not continuing to go to the moon. But, you know, what I'm describing is the reality that at some point it stops, right? It has to. It reaches a limit based on the fee ratio, where even if the transaction size is going up, the amount of carrying capacity of the money is not. The price is not going up. You know, you've reached the limit, and nothing else has that. So people assume it doesn't exist in Bitcoin too. So look very closely at the supply cap, and don't look very closely at what this implies. But these are both unique things about Bitcoin, right? They both have significant impacts. But wouldn't it be able to continue growing if, you know, our economic activity, if we're multiplanetary, for example, kept growing, then the larger size transactions would still have a usefulness, have a yeah, they have a usefulness, but again, the threshold wipes out the smaller transactions,
So as you increase the size of the average transaction, you're eliminating the ability to transact in smaller transactions when there's a lot more of those, right? So,
right, but those are taken care of by maybe the $1 Bitcoin bill instead of the.
But what I'm saying is that that one chain that has reached this threat, this kind of event horizon, right?
Yeah.
Is not going to accrue more value on the chain. It might increase in size of average transaction, pushing other transactions off into other chains. But that means that the purchasing power of the unit is not increasing. That's the consequence, right? And to me, that's fine. But speculators who are expecting that to just go up forever don't want to hear that. They don't want to hear another chain's going to come and start, monetizing. So it's interesting. Like gold is never fully monetized, right? When the demand for gold rises, and gold just an example of everything that exists except for Bitcoin, right? When there's more demand for it, more gets created, and the increasing demand for a money is a function of economic growth. There's if there's so economic growth is interest minus depreciation, right? Things depreciate constantly, and things are produced constantly, and interest is the rate of production. It's the net that you get of what you've produced. So this different, if interest is 10% and depreciation of all things averages out to like 6 or 7%, you get 2 to 3% growth, right, or 3 to 4% growth. And this growth is new stuff that's being transacted. There's new demand for money as well, and so this is why we see gold grows at a couple percent per year, because there's new demand for it, and it's being mined at that rising demand until the price comes back down to now there's no reason to mine it anymore, right? So it's never fully monetized because there's more units of the money always being created. With Bitcoin gets on a single chain gets fully monetized not because you can't create any more of it, because you can't transact, you can't put any more value into it, right? So now it's fully monetized. Where if you think of it as
why can't you put more value into it? Like if, let's say, planetary scale, we find a new planet.
In a single chain, as you increase the transaction size, you wipe out as much value as you've increased by increasing the average transaction size. So you've reached this point of perfectly diminishing returns. And
can you say that one more time? Sorry.
Well, this is a concept I thought you had. We discussed it a bit ago, where as you're increasing the minimum transaction size, right? In other words, you've got the same 5,000 or 6,000 transactions you can get into the chain per 10 minutes. With more transactions going on, they're getting batched up by essentially banks, right? Credit is getting settled in Bitcoin, and the average size is moving up. But because that fee ratio is driving that average size, it's also wiping out any transactions below that size. Right. So if the minimum transaction you could do on Bitcoin is, say, $20, because the fee ratio at $20 is 2%, nobody's going to pay any more than, or 5% or whatever, 10%, right? People reach their limit. I mean, I've never seen anything higher than kind of 10% for remittances or whatever. It's a very high rate. It wipes out a year of investment gains, and if you buy it and sell it, you're wiping out 2 years. So so say just take 10%, take 100%, whatever, right? Like so say the fees are $2 worth on a $20 transaction. You're not going to do a $2 transaction when the fees are $2. You've wiped out those possibilities. And if you assume some kind of proportionality, which I think is fairly reasonable, in other words, there's 10 times as many $20 transactions as there is $2 transactions, or vice versa. 10 times as many $2 transactions there is $20 transactions. You've just wiped out as much value on the chain by making it impossible to transact as you've increased by raising the average transaction size. Yeah. So as the average transaction size moves up, because the fee ratio is moving up, because more people are transacting, so now this has to keep moving up. What you get is wiping out as much value as you're creating, or not creating, but transacting. You can't transact in these anymore. We're going to move up. So okay, now we're doing an average of a $10,000 transaction. That means the price must be much higher, because we're doing $10,000. No, because we've wiped out everything below $10,000. It's no longer transactable. So that demand is gone. It's moved into some other money. Yeah. So what you have is you reach this limit that doesn't exist in anything else, right? This inability to create more transactability. It's not about creating more units. So if you look at it from a single chain perspective, it's fully monetized. But if you look at it as a system, right, where you have different levels of security on different chains, now it's never fully monetized, just like gold or just like everything else. And the market will do that.
Right.
The market will make sure that there is more transactability created if it wants to keep using this type of money, and nobody's going to be able to stop that.
Right. So as it develops, then lower denomination chains below the biggest one accommodate those smaller transactions, right, because they're cheaper to transact. So you're saying on the main one, once it's fully monetized, that the cost of transacting is equal to what is equal or more than what you're actually.
The fee ratio becomes prohibitive, below that level. So if the fee ratio is high enough, so it's $100 and you're doing only $1,000 transactions, right? It's a 10% fee ratio. Well, you're not going to do a $100 transaction. You might do a $10,000 transaction. So everything above is still possible, right? But everything below gets wiped out. So if that fee level goes up to $1,000, now you're not doing $1,000 transactions anymore. You're doing $10,000 transactions, but you've wiped out all the transactability below that. Right. So if the fee level is like, a penny and for all levels, okay, you've wiped out everything below a penny. Maybe that's not consequential, right? That's kind of where we started. But as it starts to move up, you start subtracting value. Now, you have to put this all in perspective when it comes to speculation, right? People will speculate on anything. But this is in terms of what they're speculating on, the ability for people to use it as money.
The only point that I was, I guess, having trouble following you on was, as high as the fee is, would it not still accommodate whatever economic activity is, whatever percentage greater than the fee?
Yes, yes, but nothing below. That's the point.
Yeah, sure. So, but as new economic activity greater than the fee comes onto the chain, wouldn't it continue to increase the price?
Imagine, like, you can only do $1 million transactions. That's not unreasonable when you're talking about the number of transactions to carry all the the activity that occurs around the world. So you can only do $1 million transactions. So where's all the other transacting going?
Yeah, down.
It's just somewhere else, right? So every time that moves up, you've eliminated those other scenarios. So the ability,
but you're introducing new, bigger ones, aren't you? Like, what if we start trading on a planetary basis?
My argument is that they're proportional. You're not introducing new, bigger ones. They already existed, right? You already had the ability to transact at any larger size you wanted to. You've just wiped out the smaller ones, right? So if you start batching up and actually transacting it at higher levels, right? You're moving that threshold up, and you're wiping out below, right?
And so what you're saying is, at a certain point, the price of that denomination that you're transacting in let's say the biggest transactions, remains the same?
Yeah, what I'm saying is, if you can't add any more demand, you're wiping out as much demand as you increase, then your purchasing power remains constant, right? And because it's a function of supply and demand, and you have a fixed supply of transactability, right? And you have rising demand, which is wiping out as much demand as its increase is representing. So yeah, it's again, I have to write this up so you can just go and read it. It's one of the things I end up talking more and more about now, and I've just been too busy.
Because I'm kind of seeing it in terms of things going in both directions, but I haven't thought about it at all either beyond this conversation. So I'm seeing it kind of the dominant one increasing in price while lower ones continue to emerge.
Take, for example, okay, people, this happened, people start rapidly transacting on Bitcoin because the price is shooting up, and fees go up to like $10, $20, $100 a transaction. What happens? People start freaking out, right? Like, we can't use this for all these things we used to use it for.
Right.
That's loss of demand, right? Now, the only question is, for
the things under that fee.
Yeah, that's clearly loss of demand. And so that's when everybody started freaking out about fees. When we hit $20,000 overnight, and people are like, fees! And then everybody's focusing on ways to mitigate fees, and we got Lightning. All right, so...
but there could have been demand for activities above those fees, right? If there were people looking to transact $1 billion, then a $20 fee wouldn't have been... Absolutely.
So that possibility still exists, right? But you have a range of, say, 0 to whatever the maximum you would possibly transact on that chain. and that domain gets cut down, right, as you move it up, right? You can't. There's a certain amount of demand for transactions at any level, and you just wipe out.
Assuming there's a maximum, though, right? What if there's no cap on the maximum size of the transaction? Like,
but
it keeps getting bigger and bigger.
People have to actually be transacting at that level, and presumably they already are, right? Why did they just start tomorrow? So what happens is the smaller transactions are being batched up into bigger transactions, and the smaller ones are being wiped out, right? And so you're aggregating, which is now creating a security issue, right? You have less people actually. If people aren't settling, right? If you're using something like Lightning and they're actually just floating and they actually can never settle, then they're just getting robbed. And so you just lose the people don't just like say, well, all of a sudden we're just going to start doing billion-dollar transactions. What's changing here is that they're batching them up because they're too expensive at lower levels. So they're being batched up into higher levels and being subtracted at the lower levels. So the net is the same. And that phenomenon doesn't exist with anything else. So people haven't even thought about it, haven't looked at it in that way. And that's what I find really interesting about deriving, behaviors from, economic behaviors and then applying these concepts to Bitcoin. Like, what can we know about this? I think that, I believe that that's provable, right? There was only one assumption there you have to make, which I've said several times. You assume proportionality. But it doesn't have to be proportional. It's just easier to see if you say it's strictly proportional, right? There's a straight line. The higher you go in price of the value you're transacting, the number of satoshis you're transacting, where it's the proportionally fewer number of possible transactions there are, right? There's presumably fewer billion-dollar transactions than there are $10 transactions, right? So it doesn't have to be proportional. But if it make it strictly proportional, there's a linear relationship between these things, right? If you make it kind of curvy and complex, well, yeah, there's still a relationship. The effect still holds. It's just not, a straight line. And I think that it's an assumption that this. Maybe there are just as many billion-dollar transactions as there is $1 transactions, right? But I think it's a reasonable assumption, right? If you're willing to accept that assumption, then you have to come to this conclusion.
Yeah.
The mitigation for this, or the market solution to this, is just to create more transaction supply in another chain. But that doesn't change anything about the demand on the original chain. It may start moving demand, right? These transactions that are getting batched up at lower security because they're using something like Lightning, they get transacted on another chain, and so now you might even start to drain value from the original chain, and you'll see this kind of. Presumably, eventually, you'd see this equilibrium being reached between these two chains, right?
Right.
They would, and then there would be the same problem would propagate into another one and another one and another one. So to me, that's
I see what you're saying.
Supply of transactability being created constantly, and that does happen. We have shitcoins, but we also have altcoins, which are kind of doing that, right? And they're small, but they're small because one, that this whole market is very immature, but two, Bitcoin BTC has very low fees. It's because there's not an awful lot of transaction demand, and once you have that, you would see this happening. And maybe it doesn't look like it looks today, but the only complaint you would have against that is people saying, well, my Bitcoin's not going to go to the moon if that happens, right? I don't give a fuck. That's not my objective. So I just, these are silly arguments. It's not what we're here for.
Well, I guess the saving grace is that it could still go, I guess, presumably a lot higher than it is today before the necessity for. And presumably,
if you have a new chain monetizing. Right. Presumably, if you have a new chain,
there'd be a lot of opportunity there too.
Option there, right?
Yeah.
So, this other thing that's kind of unique about Bitcoin is this kind of, this kind of instant monetization, right? Where you go from nothing to something, and there's nothing else that really does that either, right? Gold has been around for a long time. All these things that we use as money have been around for a long time, so they just continuously being monetized. as more is getting created.
And the monetization of those smaller denominations will probably happen a lot faster because the primary one has been monetized already, and it's just a matter of moving value over to that new one.
So there's an economic incentive for people to speculate on that monetization, which is what provides its kind of rapid evolution into a reasonably secure chain for those smaller transactions.
Yeah.
And somebody, we've already seen this. Somebody has to fork up a shit ton of cash to actually bootstrap it, right? Or a bunch of miners have to kind of come together and decide we're going to speculate on this money, or it's not going to be securable. But that will happen if there's enough speculative demand in the monetization of that money as a result of the other ones starting to be fully monetized.
Yeah.
People will get together and say, okay, on this day we're all going to start mining, and they start, maybe. This has been done on kind of a more centralized scale with forks and stuff where, I don't know. It's funny, like people look at splits and they go, well, somebody splits off and starts mining their own, and they assume that means it has value, right? Like it took some value from Bitcoin. Well, it only could possibly take value from Bitcoin is if people decide to start using it, right? Start trading it. If somebody just goes off and starts mining a fork, it doesn't mean anything, right? You go do whatever you want, right? It doesn't start with value. All it starts with is allocation. Everybody that had some Bitcoin outputs now has some fork outputs. Doesn't mean there's any value in it at all. Somebody actually has to be willing to trade it, invest in mining it, and that's new value. Unless it's somehow taking people that used to be over here and moving them over there, right? But if people want to use a different money, that's their prerogative. So,
and I'm sure it's never absolute, right? It's a little bit of all those categories until one of them becomes more pronounced.
I didn't understand. What do you mean, all those categories?
Well, you're basically saying like there's something like a fork doesn't have value until it's being traded and transacted, right?
Yeah, people have to accept it and trade for something, or it's useless.
Right, or until people are consciously monetizing it, for example, right?
Well, yeah, they're speculating on its future use to them in trade,
right.
Or they're actually using it in trade. But either way, they're trading something for it. Somebody's selling it. Miners are selling it. They're trading electricity. They're trading energy for it. So people are buying it.
Therefore, value.
Right, so if people are willing to trade it, it can take on value. And the only real difference between a split and an alt is the pre-allocation of the units, right?
Yeah.
Like as it monetizes, everybody's all the people that had some of the other now have some of this. So to me, there's not like some other advantage, like we split so we have more security. No, maybe in the fact that it's already distributed, better than airdrop or something, but it's not like there's some money being subtracted out. It has to be created, right? So people have argued against like this idea that alts would just come or splits would come and create transactability at lower value in that. Well, that's just, if we could do that, then there would be arbitrary inflation. The money would be worth nothing. I'm like, no, this doesn't have any value unless people actually start paying for it, right? So it's only viable when that happens, and so it's no different than mining more gold, where there's infinite gold out there that we could somehow mine or create, but people won't actually do it until it has some value, and it's the same way with creating other chains, other monies. Like it won't happen unless there's value in doing it, and once it does, there's a cost to doing it, right? The cost is equal to the value that people perceive. The cost of mining it, the cost of trading it is not just free, right? It has to be paid for. So it's not arbitrary, kind of seigniorage or just arbitrary inflation, but it solves a couple of problems, right? It solves this limit on transactability, and it also solves what I call a sharding problem, right? The risk to people's centralization, but the risk to being able to operate in secret because you're carrying so much data Well, now, if you're working at lower levels of security, you can have a lot less data and still, which is, maybe, one of the arguments for alt versus a split, because you're not carrying the entire history with you. But you still have to build it up somehow. So.
Well, look, man, I know I got to let you go. We said 35 minutes an hour ago, so we're coming up on 3.5 hours. But, man, really enjoyed this conversation. I could go for much longer, but I know it's bedtime for you over there. So we'll have to pick it up again some other time. Maybe give this space a half a year to continue evolving, and then we can pick up the conversation then. But yeah, really appreciate it, man. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for the time. Did you want to direct people anywhere, or just Google you and they'll know how to find you?
Yeah, Twitter, Voskuil is where I have kind of public conversations, and I have the software Libbitcoin is in GitHub/Libbitcoin. All my crypto economics stuff is in the Libbitcoin system repo wiki. It's very deeply buried, so hard to find.
Well, lots of reading there. Believe it or not, there was a ton of things I wanted to get into. I've got, but
I'm glad to hear somebody's reading it. That's good. That's good to hear. We're talking about doing so there's also, for people that are interested, we have this, Tom Pakia and I and Lucas Betchart have created a nonprofit, which is pending IRS approval, but we should have it, I think, and for raising money for Libbitcoin developers. We've been pretty lucky in the past getting some generous donations to pay for people to work full time. So there's that. You can contact me about that if somebody wants to contribute to Bitcoin core development and in a different way. And there's also looks like in March we'll be putting on a crypto economics conference talking about this stuff. Yeah, probably in Hanoi. Hanoi.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's not been announced yet. I don't have any details for you. The website's still blank, but yeah, it looks like it's going to happen. So it's something to look forward to in the future if you're interested in this kind of stuff.
Why Hanoi? Just out of curiosity.
Why not?
Fair enough.
Yeah, there's funny reasons, but it's I think it'll be fun.
Yeah. All right, Eric. Any further parting thoughts, or you filled up for now?
Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for having me on, John. Appreciate it.
All right, man. Keep up the great work. Take care of yourself.
You too. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye bye.